Story 1. When Jacob Miller first arrived in the small town of Willowbrook, it seemed like any other sleepy, forgotten place nestled in the hills. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting long, amber shadows across the cobblestone streets. The kind of place where everyone knows your name and nothing much ever happens. The kind of place that seemed like it had been frozen in time, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. He had heard about Willowbrook from a friend, someone who'd once lived here, claiming it was a nice, quiet town, just right for someone looking to get away from the hustle and bustle. Jacob wasn't sure about the quiet part, but that's exactly what he needed. After a year of running from his own demons, he found himself on a road that led him here, to this place, to escape from his past and rebuild a future that didn't involve memories of loss. At first, the town seemed welcoming. The locals were friendly enough, the shopkeepers polite, the children laughing as they played on the swings. But Jacob noticed something peculiar, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't the people. They were kind, albeit a bit too quiet, but rather the feel of the town itself. There was a pervasive sense of restraint in the air. The kind of heaviness that makes you think something is wrong, but no one will tell you what it is. It was like a shared secret everyone knew but never spoke about. The old man at the gas station had smiled at him, eyes narrowing as if measuring his soul, then warned him, "Be back before dark." Jacob, thinking it was just a quirky small-town thing, laughed it off. The sun hadn't set yet, so he decided to wander around a little longer before heading back to the small bed and breakfast he had rented for the week. As the evening progressed, the sky turned a deep purple, and a low, thick fog began to roll in from the woods that bordered the town. It was strange, he thought. It was only late afternoon when he first arrived, but now it felt like the entire town was shifting into something else entirely. He made his way down to the town square, past the old church with its towering spire that seemed to pierce the sky, and the small, quaint stores that lined the streets. As the first stars began to twinkle above, Jacob stopped at a bench and looked around. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every person he saw, though they went about their business, had that same strange look in their eyes. Their faces were blank, almost expectant. A chill ran through him, but he tried to dismiss it. It was just nerves, he told himself. He had spent too many years in high-stress jobs to let something as trivial as a few odd looks get to him. But when he turned the corner, ready to head back to his room, he noticed the streetlights flickering, one by one, as though something unseen had triggered their lights to go out. It was then that he saw the woman standing across the street. She was staring at him, her gaze fixed and unblinking. She was dressed in a simple, worn dress, her gray hair pulled back into a tight bun. She looked out of place, standing in the growing darkness as the fog crept in around her. Her eyes glowed slightly, faintly, as if something was alive in them, something unnatural. Jacob was about to walk past her when she spoke in a voice so quiet he almost didn't hear it. "You're new here. You need to leave before the sun goes down." Jacob froze, the words slicing through the air like a sharp blade. He looked up, but the woman was already turning away, disappearing into the fog as if she had never been there at all. It was then that he felt it. The air suddenly felt thicker, heavier. The sky above had darkened more than it should have in the span of a few moments. The streetlights flickered again and then went out completely. With his heart in his throat, Jacob hurried back to the bed and breakfast, hoping the woman's words were just the ramblings of an eccentric. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong in this town, something that no one was talking about. The night stretched long and uneventful, though Jacob didn't sleep much. His mind kept replaying the woman's warning, and though he tried to ignore it, a deep, gnawing anxiety settled into his gut. He spent the following day exploring more of Willowbrook, trying to get a sense of its rhythm. The people seemed to go about their daily lives, smiling, talking, helping one another, but there was an unspoken undercurrent that made his skin crawl. It was as though the entire town had an agreement, a tacit understanding that there was something no one was willing to acknowledge. He tried to speak with the locals, to get a feel for what made them tick, but every time he asked about the woman or the strange atmosphere, they would change the subject, offering polite but vague answers. It was as if they had practiced avoiding certain topics, like a silent pact had been made to never address the growing darkness that seemed to creep into every corner of Willowbrook. That evening, as he walked back to his bed and breakfast, he noticed something unsettling. The fog had returned, thicker than before. And just like the night before, the streetlights flickered and dimmed as he made his way down the street. He couldn't see anything beyond the dense fog, but the silence around him felt wrong, like the entire town had been sealed in a thick, suffocating shell. He couldn't escape the feeling that something was following him. Jacob tried to hurry, but every step he took felt like it was taking longer than it should. The fog pressed in around him, thick and unrelenting. It was as if the world beyond the fog didn't exist. Every sound seemed muffled, as though the air itself had absorbed the noise, leaving him alone in a world where nothing moved. He was almost to the bed and breakfast when he saw them, dozens of figures standing at the edges of the town, just beyond the thick fog. They were all watching him. Their eyes gleamed faintly, reflecting the dim light, but there was no movement. No sign of life. Jacob froze in place. There was something about their stillness that made his skin crawl, something wrong about the way they stood there in perfect silence, waiting. His instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet refused to move. It felt as though time itself had slowed to a crawl. Then, a whisper came to him, drifting from the shadows. "You should not have stayed. You're not welcome here after dark." It was the woman again. Her voice carried through the fog like a warning, but before Jacob could turn around to find her, the darkness took over completely. The fog swallowed the town, and the figures around him melted into it. And then, there was nothing. Jacob spent a sleepless night, tossing and turning, trying to shake off the eerie feelings that had begun to consume him. The figures in the fog. The chilling whisper of the woman's voice. The oppressive silence that followed him through the streets like a shadow. He had to remind himself that he was just in a small town. People talked differently, acted differently in rural areas, right? That's all this was. But every part of him felt pulled into the darker layers of this town, as if it were a puzzle he had no choice but to solve. The following day, Jacob set out with the intention of learning more about Willowbrook's peculiarities. He couldn't stay locked up in his room. He had to talk to people, dig deeper. He needed to know why everything felt wrong, why he had been warned about the darkness, why no one seemed willing to speak of it. The town, however, greeted him with the same strange, oppressive atmosphere. The people went about their day in silence, exchanging only polite nods, quick smiles, or empty pleasantries. The air was thick with something unspoken. They had a quiet, subtle way of avoiding him, especially when he asked about the night or the things he'd seen in the fog. At the local diner, He sat across from an elderly man named Mr. Patterson, who seemed to have a perpetual smile on his face. "Just came into town, huh?" Mr. Patterson asked with a chuckle, his wrinkled eyes crinkling with the kind of warmth that should have made Jacob feel at ease. "Well, you're right on time. We don't see many newcomers." Jacob leaned in slightly, trying to sound casual. "I've noticed something strange, though. Last night, there was a kind of fog. People acted weird. And the lights went out. It felt like I wasn't supposed to be here after dark. Is there something about the town I should know?" Mr. Patterson's eyes flickered with something Jacob couldn't identify. A brief flash of fear? No, he must have imagined it. The old man cleared his throat, setting down his coffee. His smile faltered slightly, replaced with an odd kind of weariness. "Best not ask about the dark," he said, his voice low. "Not everyone around here likes to talk about it. Some things, they're better left alone. The dark is best avoided." Jacob frowned, perplexed. "What do you mean by that? What happens after dark?" Mr. Patterson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward the window, as if looking for someone. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You'll see, when it's your time." Jacob's brow furrowed. The conversation was getting stranger by the second. Mr. Patterson's warning, combined with the strange atmosphere of the town, was beginning to unsettle him more than he cared to admit. He needed answers. "I think you're just paranoid. It's just fog and old-timers' tales," Jacob said, trying to convince himself more than Mr. Patterson. He rose from the table, tossing a few bills onto the counter, and gave the elderly man a forced smile. "Thanks for the coffee." As he left the diner, he could feel the weight of the man's words lingering in the air. The dark is best avoided. But what did that mean? By late afternoon, Jacob had made his way to the town library, hoping to find something in the dusty old records, something that might explain the unease he had been feeling. He had looked up a few things on the town's history before, but there was very little available online. His computer kept glitching when he tried to access anything more substantial, but that was probably just his luck. The library smelled of mildew and old paper, the silence almost deafening as he walked between the narrow aisles lined with books. The librarian, a woman with thin gray hair and thick glasses, looked up as he entered. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice surprisingly loud in the quiet space. "I'm looking for anything on Willowbrook's history," Jacob said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Specifically, what happens here after dark?" Her expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "What's it that you're looking for exactly?" Jacob shifted on his feet. "Anything strange? Unusual? I've noticed a lot of odd behavior lately. People seem to be avoiding the night." The librarian pursed her lips and nodded slowly. "I see." She didn't say anything for a long moment, her eyes studying him as if weighing his words carefully. "You're new to town. If you want to know about Willowbrook's past, you'll have to go back to the older records. The newer ones won't do. The past, well, it's better kept quiet, you see." Jacob's curiosity spiked. "What do you mean?" She handed him a thick, dusty ledger from the back of the library. "That's where the history is. It might give you answers, but be warned. Some of the things you'll read aren't meant to be remembered. She said it so matter-of-factly, as if she'd warned many before him. Jacob hesitated for a moment, but the sense of dread was growing stronger inside him, and the need to understand was overwhelming. He took the ledger from her and found a quiet corner to sit. The book's pages were yellowed, brittle with age, and as he flipped through it, he found mention of strange occurrences, people disappearing, animals found mutilated, children wandering the woods at night without remembering how they got there. The final entry, however, stopped him dead in his tracks. At the end of every year, after the harvest is done, the darkness comes. It is not the kind of darkness that falls with the setting sun. It is the kind that lives within the town. It is the reckoning. Those who have strayed too far, or who have disobeyed the rules, will be taken by it. No one speaks of the names of the disappeared, and no one will speak of it after they are gone. They must never speak of it. The darkness must be fed. Jacob felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. This wasn't just superstition or a town myth. It was a warning passed down through generations. The more he read, the more he realized that the townsfolk weren't merely avoiding the night, they were living in constant fear of something beyond their understanding. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he closed the ledger, the words weighing heavily on his mind. The darkness wasn't just an abstract concept. It was real. That night, as Jacob made his way back to the bed and breakfast, the same unsettling feeling returned. The fog rolled in, thicker than ever before. The streetlights flickered, one by one, casting long shadows across the street. Jacob knew that the town's silence was no accident, no coincidence. He tried to ignore the rising panic in his chest, tried to tell himself it was all in his head. But as he passed the town square, he felt it. The eyes. He turned sharply and saw them, figures standing in the fog, their faces barely visible in the dim light, but their eyes, those eyes, glowed with an unnatural, sickly light, watching him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as they slowly moved toward him, not in a rush, but in a deliberate, terrifyingly calm manner. His breath caught in his throat as he backed away slowly. He tried to make sense of it, but the images blurred, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The people, they weren't moving. They weren't supposed to be here. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, a voice that sounded as if it came from within the earth itself, one of them said, "You've seen too much, outsider. You should have never stayed." Jacob turned and ran, heart thundering in his chest, as the town seemed to close in on him, the fog swallowing him whole. Jacob's breath came in sharp, panic gasps as he ran through the fog. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The figures with glowing eyes had surrounded him, had spoken to him. He had been warned, and yet there was no escaping it now. No denying the truth. He had seen them, whatever they were, and they had seen him. He made his way back to his room at the bed and breakfast, his pulse still thudding in his ears. He could hear the fog pressing in around him, the faint sound of footsteps behind him, though no one was there. The town felt alive, and the deeper he walked into it, the more suffocating the air became. Inside the small room, he locked the door behind him, though it did little to ease his anxiety. The window was closed tight, the curtains drawn shut. The silence in the room was deafening, and every part of him screamed to get out, to leave Willowbrook behind. But even as he thought it, he knew it wasn't that simple. It was too late. He was already in it. He had already crossed the point of no return. That's when he heard a knock. The soft, polite tapping on the door cut through the tension in his chest, but the fear that gripped him held him frozen. He didn't want to open it, didn't want to see who was on the other side. But the knocking continued, a rhythmic pattern that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. Reluctantly, Jacob made his way to the door. He peered through the peephole, his heart in his throat, expecting to see one of the figures from the square. But it wasn't them. It was the woman. The one who had warned him the first night, standing there just beyond the door, her face as unreadable as it had been when he first saw her. He opened the door, just a crack, enough to see her clearly. Her eyes were cold, piercing, and there was a knowing look in them that made him feel small, insignificant. "I told you to leave before nightfall," she said, her voice a low whisper. "But you didn't listen. You should have listened." I don't understand," Jacob stammered, his voice shaky. "What is this? What's happening to me?" The woman's lips parted into a small, sad smile. "It's not happening to you, Jacob. It's happening because of you." He stared at her, utterly confused. "What does that mean?" "You've crossed the line," she said quietly. "You opened the window, and now you've seen what was meant to remain hidden. The darkness, the thing that walks when the sun sets, it has already marked you. You're a part of it now, whether you like it or not. And you'll never leave this place, not really." Jacob's legs felt weak beneath him as he tried to process what she was saying. The darkness? The figures? What do they want with me? The woman sighed, her expression unreadable. "They don't want anything from you, Jacob. They're not interested in you. What you've seen, what you've uncovered, that is what they want. The truth. The reckoning. The price to be paid." The woman stepped forward, her presence almost too much for Jacob to handle. Her breath, cold and heavy, brushed against his skin as she spoke. "The darkness feeds on fear, on secrets, on those who dare to uncover what has been buried. It feeds on you, Jacob. It feeds on the very thing that brought you here." He didn't understand. His mind was a blur, the fog outside pressing in harder, his sense of time completely gone. I don't want this. I just came here to escape. I didn't know." "You didn't know, but you're not the first," she interrupted. "Others before you came, and others before them. They came seeking refuge, seeking peace. But in Willowbrook, there's no peace. Not after the sun goes down. After dark, everything changes." Jacob's hands gripped the door frame tightly, his knuckles turning white. "What are you saying? Why am I still here? What is this town hiding?" The woman stepped back, her eyes narrowing, her voice dropping into something more dangerous. "You've asked too many questions, Jacob. Now you'll learn what happens when you stay past the darkness. The town doesn't like visitors who pry. But it's too late. You've already opened the door to it." With that, the woman turned, disappearing into the night before Jacob could say another word. Jacob shut the door with shaking hands, feeling the weight of what she had said crash down upon him. The darkness feeds on fear. The reckoning. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't run anymore. The sound of the fog pressing against the window made his heart race again. He turned toward it, half expecting to see something in the distance, but all he saw was the dim glow of the streetlights filtering through the heavy mist. Suddenly, the air grew colder. There was a knock again. The knocking was different this time. It wasn't on the door, it was from the window. A soft, methodical tap. 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 Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He didn't move. His feet felt like they were glued to the floor as he stared at the window, his heart pounding harder with every tap. The sound grew louder. Closer. The tap 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 was joined by a scraping noise, like claws dragging across glass. The fog outside had grown thick, swirling like a living thing. His pulse quickened as the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching across the room. "Open it," a whisper came from the other side of the window, like a voice carried on the wind. It wasn't the woman's voice anymore. It was deeper, more guttural. "Open the window, Jacob. Let me in." The whispers filled his mind, overwhelming his thoughts, drowning out all rational thought. Fear clawed at him, but his feet wouldn't move. His body wouldn't listen. The window was there, wide open in his mind, and he knew that if he opened it, something would come through. The shadow, the darkness, would enter his world, and there would be no turning back. But he had already made the choice, hadn't he? His curiosity had led him to this point. He had opened the door, let the darkness seep into his mind, and now it had come for him. Slowly, painfully, Jacob reached toward the window, his fingers trembling. The glass was cold to the touch, and as his hand closed around the handle, he felt it. The pull. The darkness. With one final breath, Jacob yanked the window open. 3.4 the final hour. The wind that poured through the window was icy, like it had come straight from the grave. The room was plunged into darkness as the shadows twisted and writhed. He could feel them, the eyes, watching him from the other side. A loud screech filled the air, followed by the sound of scraping nails on wood, and then silence. He turned, but the room was empty. But it wasn't. The dark figure was there, standing in the corner. It was tall, impossibly so, with glowing eyes and skin that seemed to shift, like a mass of swirling black mist. Its presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread, and Jacob's chest tightened as he stared into its eyes, unable to look away. "Welcome home," the figure whispered. Jacob fell to his knees, the weight of it all crashing down on him. The darkness had taken him. He was part of it now. Jacob's vision blurred, and his breath caught in his throat as the figure in the corner of the room seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly. The eyes, those glowing, soulless eyes, bore into him, sending waves of terror through his chest. He had no choice but to look at it, to accept it. This thing that had been waiting for him for so long was here now, and there was nothing he could do to escape it. "You knew this would happen," the shadow spoke, its voice low and guttural, like the sound of cracking stone. "You sought the truth, and now you've seen it." Jacob's pulse thundered in his ears. He could hardly breathe, his mind racing with confusion and panic. The truth? What truth? He hadn't known what he was getting into when he came to Willowbrook. He had only wanted peace. Escape. A chance to start over. But now, as the darkness enveloped the room, he realized how naive he had been. "I didn't mean to," he began, his voice shaking. You never mean to, the figure interrupted, its form flickering like smoke. No one ever means to. But the town has a way of drawing people like you in, people who think they can change their fate. People who think they can escape the past. But once you've opened the window, once you've seen what's on the other side, there's no turning back. Jacob tried to move, tried to stand up, but his legs felt like lead. He wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't. He was trapped in the room, in the darkness, with something ancient and malevolent. The shadows stretched further, swallowing the corners of the room, as if the entire space was collapsing inward. This town, Jacob, has a history. A secret. A pact that was made long ago. The shadow's voice grew colder. When the darkness comes, the town must pay a price. You, an outsider, were the price this time. Your knowledge, your presence, was the opening. And now that you've seen, now that you know too much, you must pay the cost. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest, his hands clammy with sweat. He couldn't understand. What are you talking about? What is the price? The shadow tilted its head, as if amused by his confusion. The price is always the same. It is the soul, the essence of the one who dares to witness the truth. The one who dares to ask questions. And tonight, Jacob, it's your turn. The room seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing thick, suffocating. He felt a chill settle deep into his bones, the cold seeping into every pore. The presence of the shadow was overwhelming, pressing on him from all sides. His mind raced, his thoughts swirling in a vortex of terror and disbelief. I didn't ask for this, Jacob whispered, his voice barely audible. The shadow's eyes glowed brighter, the darkness deepening around it. But you came here anyway. You searched for answers. And now you must pay. Jacob's breath hitched. He could feel something inside him, something he didn't understand, being tugged away, slowly, as if a part of him was being extracted. A deep, guttural feeling of emptiness spread from the pit of his stomach, radiating out into his limbs, leaving him cold and hollow. It's the price of knowledge, the shadow continued. The price of discovery. The town has always fed the darkness, and you, it paused, letting the weight of its words hang in the air. You are the one who has given it life once more. Samantha could feel herself losing grip on her surroundings. The town's curse, had been sealed in the dark for so long. But now, the shadow that had been waiting patiently for an opening had entered. And the town had no choice but to feed it. He thought about the townspeople, the ones who had warned him to leave before nightfall, the ones who had avoided his questions. They weren't afraid of the shadow, they had accepted it, lived with it, knowing the price that came with their silence. They were complicit. But Jacob had unwittingly become a part of that bargain, too. The cost of his curiosity, his presence in this town, had been his soul. And as the shadow loomed over him, as the air grew colder and his vision dimmed, Jacob realized the terrible truth. There was no escape. Not for him. Not for anyone who had dared to uncover Willowbrook's dark secrets. The shadow loomed closer, its presence overwhelming. Jacob's heart thundered in his chest as he felt his body growing weaker, as though the life was being drained from him, bit by bit. He wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to escape this fate, but the darkness was too strong. It had already claimed him. But then, just as he thought all was lost, a thought crossed his mind. A desperate, fleeting thought. Could he still stop it? He didn't know where the strength came from, but something deep inside him pushed him to move, to take control of his own fate. As the shadow advanced, its cold, oppressive presence closing in, Jacob forced himself to speak. "I won't let you take me," he said, his voice hoarse, but filled with an unexpected resolve. The shadow stopped. For a moment, the room fell into a deep silence, broken only by the sound of his labored breathing. The eyes of the figure flickered, narrowing as if assessing him. "You think you can stop it?" the shadow hissed, its voice now filled with anger. "You are nothing more than a passing thought to the darkness. Your will means nothing here." But Jacob's resolve only grew stronger. The strange, pulsing emptiness inside him became a fire, a burning will to resist. The shadow recoiled slightly, as if sensing something it could not control. "I refuse," Jacob said again, his words now sharper, more forceful. "I refuse to be part of this. You'll never have me. Never." The darkness seemed to waver for a moment, as if the very air around it was trembling. Jacob's heart raced faster, his blood pounding in his ears. The shadow hissed and twisted, its form flickering as if being torn apart by invisible forces. And then, with a final screech that echoed through the room, the shadow vanished. The darkness that had filled the space slowly began to recede, pulling back like a tide, leaving the room dim but empty. The air lightened, the suffocating weight lifting, though a lingering sense of dread remained. Jacob stood there, gasping for air, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The room was silent. The town outside was still. The fog had receded, leaving the streets eerily quiet. For the first time since he had arrived, Jacob felt a strange sense of peace. But as he turned to leave, he knew, deep down, that the town's curse had not been broken. The shadow had not been destroyed, it had only retreated, biding its time. And one day, it would return. The town of Willowbrook was silent again. The streets, once dark and suffocating, were now calm. The residents moved through their daily routines, their eyes cast down, as if nothing had ever happened. Jacob knew he couldn't stay. The darkness that lived in Willowbrook had been there long before he arrived, and it would be there long after he was gone. But he had learned one painful truth: the town was not just a place. It was a living, breathing thing, feeding on fear, on the silence of its people, on the souls of those who dared to pry into its secrets. And for now, at least, Jacob had escaped. But the fear, the presence of the shadow, would remain with him forever. The darkness had been pushed back, but it would return. It always did. Story 2. It was a morning like any other. Isaac Thompson sat at his kitchen table, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air, newspapers spread out before him. The headlines were the same as usual: politics, sports, the weather. Nothing unusual. He skimmed through the articles half-heartedly, waiting for the moment when his mind would wander to something more important. A flicker of dissatisfaction stirred within him. It had been years since he had felt any sense of excitement. Work was mundane, life was routine, and despite his attempts to shake things up, nothing seemed to change. He had become comfortable with the stagnation, comfortable in the quiet monotony of his existence. His life felt like a slow-motion replay of yesterday's events. The only excitement was the mild sense of dread that came with knowing nothing ever really changed. The edges of his life were beginning to feel frayed, like the pages of an old book that had been opened too many times. But all of that was about to change. Isaac's eyes drifted from the newspaper to the window. The light outside was soft, golden, like it had always been at that time of day. He absent-mindedly tapped his finger on his coffee cup. His gaze shifted back to the table, where a small, unmarked envelope lay on the edge. It had appeared out of nowhere, an intrusion into his otherwise dull morning. The envelope was simple, white with no return address. No name. No stamp. Just a plain, square piece of paper that seemed utterly ordinary, and yet it filled him with an odd sense of unease. He reached for it, his fingers trembling slightly. His mind raced with questions. Who had left it? How had it gotten there? He wasn't expecting any mail, not today. His pulse quickened as he flipped the envelope over. There was nothing, no writing, no indication of who it was from. He tore it open, half expecting nothing more than a junk flyer or perhaps a misplaced advertisement. But inside, folded neatly, was a single sheet of paper written in black ink. His name, Isaac Thompson, was written at the top. No salutation, just the words. You will not remember receiving this. But when the time comes, you will know exactly what to do. His heart skipped a beat. He turned the paper over, hoping for some kind of explanation, but the back was blank. No clue. No further instructions. He stared at the words again, but they made no more sense the second time. A sudden chill ran through him, and his fingers tightened around the paper. He felt the hairs on his neck rise as if something was watching him. But there was nothing unusual in the room. The air was still, the world outside moving on without him. Was this some sort of joke? A prank? He glanced around, expecting someone to jump out from the shadows, laughing at his bewildered reaction. But no one was there. The feeling of unease continued to settle deeper into his stomach. He tried to push the feeling away. He was probably just overreacting. Nothing had happened, right? Isaac's fingers curled tightly around the edges of the paper, and the message burned in his mind. It was a warning, something that came from the future. He couldn't explain it, but it didn't matter, it was real. He threw the paper back onto the table, his mind racing. Should he tell someone about this? Was this just some bizarre mistake? Before he could think further, the clock on the wall struck noon. It felt as though the seconds had stretched into hours as he tried to make sense of what he'd read. There was an odd sensation creeping into his thoughts, something primal, like the undercurrent of a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. Isaac could sense it, the pressure of something about to break, something inevitable. The time for rationality was over. The letter had arrived for a reason. And Isaac's life, it seemed, was about to take a turn he couldn't escape. The evening passed uneventfully, but Isaac couldn't shake the feeling of something heavy hanging in the air. The letter sat on the table, taunting him with its cryptic message. He had tried to focus on his usual routine, watching TV, browsing the internet, even attempting to read a book, but nothing held his attention. His mind kept returning to the letter. There was something about the words, the warning. The idea that he would know what to do when the time came, but what time? He had no idea what it was referring to. And what could possibly happen that was so monumental? At around 10 p.m., Isaac sat in front of his bedroom mirror, staring at his reflection. He rubbed his tired eyes, staring into the dark circles under them. The events of the day seemed like a dream already, but the letter burned in his thoughts. He stood up, brushing his hands over his face. Something about his reflection seemed wrong. It wasn't that his features had changed. No, his face was still his own, but there was a subtle difference. A shadow in his expression. It was like his reflection was slightly off. He frowned. It wasn't just the exhaustion. It felt like there was something lurking behind his eyes, a presence that wasn't quite him. The reflection seemed to glare back at him, and he quickly looked away, shaking his head. "I need to get some sleep," he muttered to himself, feeling the weight of the day finally closing in on him. The strangeness of the letter had left him uneasy, but he tried to brush it off as paranoia. Maybe he was just too tired. He turned to the bed, and then, just as he began to lie down, he noticed something that stopped him cold. The reflection in the mirror hadn't moved with him. For a moment, it just stood there, staring back at him as if it were waiting. The edges of his reflection were blurry now, flickering like a bad TV signal. Isaac's heart leapt into his throat as his reflection gave a small, chilling grin. Not his smile. Not his movements. It was the other him. The one that had been waiting. The one he had seen in the mirror before. Without thinking, Isaac turned away from the mirror, a chill creeping down his spine. He didn't know what he had seen, but something in him told him he had just crossed another line, a line he didn't fully understand yet. He shook his head, as though trying to clear away the hallucination, but the memory of the grin lingered, clinging to him like a shadow that wouldn't let go. The next morning, Isaac woke up in a cold sweat. The events of the night before felt like a dream, but the unease stayed with him, as though the dream were still crawling around in his mind, festering. His reflection, that grin, was all he could think about. He took the letter from the table again, reading it over and over as if searching for some sort of clue, some meaning hidden in the words. But it remained as cryptic as before. And then, as the day wore on, things began to change. Small things at first, unnoticed shifts in his routine. The lights flickered as he walked into his apartment. The coffee pot was already on when he went to make a cup. The television, which he had turned off the night before, was on, playing static. None of these things were out of place, but they felt wrong. Every shift, every oddity gnawed at his sanity, like the world itself was bending and twisting in ways he couldn't explain. The sense of foreboding continued to grow stronger as the day turned to evening. And then, he noticed it, the same reflection. The same grin. In the glass, in the windows, even in the surfaces around him. He was watching him. It wasn't just in the mirror anymore. Isaac couldn't stop looking at the reflections. Everywhere he turned, they were there, watching him, flickering just behind the glass, in windows, mirrors, even the surface of his coffee cup. His own face had taken on an unsettling quality, as if it wasn't his at all. It wasn't just that the grinning figure appeared occasionally. No, it was the feeling that it was always there, always waiting. It wasn't paranoia. He knew it wasn't. It was something else. Something deeper. That evening, as the sun sank below the horizon and the darkness crept over the town, Isaac tried to push the unsettling thoughts out of his mind. He worked late at the office, focusing on menial tasks, anything to distract himself from the gnawing feeling that the world around him was starting to slip, like the pages of a book that had been torn from their bindings. When he returned home, his apartment felt strange, as though it were no longer his. His footsteps echoed unnaturally in the quiet hallway, and the familiar creaks of the wooden floors felt louder, somehow. He couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was just out of sight, watching him from the shadows. The mirror in his hallway seemed larger now, its surface reflecting more than it should, showing a distorted version of the room. Isaac couldn't explain it. He stepped closer, his reflection greeting him with that same grin, unnerving, but somehow familiar. It wasn't a stranger's smile, it was his, or rather, it used to be. No, Isaac whispered to himself, trying to step away from the mirror, but his reflection didn't move the way it should have. It was slower, lagging behind, like it was on its own separate timeline. The corners of his reflection's lips pulled tighter, stretching unnaturally. The grin wasn't friendly anymore, it was sickening. Isaac spun around, away from the mirror, and grabbed his coat from the hook by the door. He needed fresh air. He needed to escape from the suffocating atmosphere that was beginning to close in around him. But as he reached for the door, it happened. The shiver. The unmistakable feeling of something moving behind him. Isaac froze, his hand hovering over the doorknob, his breath caught in his throat. He didn't dare turn around. The room felt too still. Too quiet. As though the world outside had stopped turning and all that remained was him, waiting. He could feel it, creeping closer. Don't turn around, a voice inside his head urged. Just leave. Get out. But curiosity, something darker, pushed him forward. He slowly turned his head, almost in slow motion, as if he were afraid of what he might see. In the hallway mirror, his reflection was no longer mimicking his movements. It was facing the other way. It wasn't just standing still, it was moving independently, walking away from him, toward the hallway. No, Isaac thought, this isn't real. But his feet didn't move. His breath caught in his throat, and as the reflection turned its back to him, Isaac saw its grin widen further, and possibly wide, and it whispered his name. I'll be waiting for you, Isaac. You'll never escape. Isaac snapped out of his trance, his pulse pounding in his chest. He rushed out of the apartment, not bothering to lock the door behind him. The chill of the evening air bit into his skin, but the cold was a welcome reprieve from the madness inside. He had to get to the bottom of this. He had to understand what was happening. But his mind wouldn't let him go any further without the letter that had started all of this. He had kept it in his jacket pocket, not wanting to let it out of his sight. Now, as he stood on the street corner, he pulled it out once again. You will not remember receiving this. But when the time comes, you will know exactly what to do. He reread the words, his eyes scanning them again and again. But the more he read, the more distorted they seemed. He was remembering, wasn't he? He had received it. He had remembered. His fingers trembled as he folded the letter back into his coat pocket. The unsettling thought that the letter might have been from himself, from his future self, had been with him ever since he'd read it. But what did it mean? What was coming? He walked, the fog rising around him as the sun dipped below the horizon. The streetlights flickered to life one by one, casting long, stretched shadows across the sidewalk. There was a palpable sense of dread now, in the air, in the buildings, in the very streets of the town. The world felt like it was in a holding pattern, teetering on the edge of something terrible. He walked until his legs grew tired and the fog seemed to thicken around him. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional car driving by with its headlights casting a brief moment of light before disappearing into the dark. A soft sound drifted toward him. A whisper. "You should have listened," it said. Isaac's breath hitched. He looked around, but no one was in sight. There was no one on the street, no figure in the fog, nothing. It came again, only louder this time. "You've opened the door, Isaac. And now there's no going back." Isaac stopped dead in his tracks, the words slamming into him like a wave. He was no longer on the sidewalk. The streets had vanished, replaced by an endless stretch of blackness, the sound of his footsteps muted by the eerie silence. There was no fog here. No buildings. Just darkness. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. The letter, the reflection, the whispers, it was all connected. He had stepped into something that had been waiting for him. The future had already been written, and there was no escaping it. The door. The words of the letter echoed in his mind. The door. "You'll know what to do." He turned around, and there it was. A door. Wooden, old, with brass handles gleaming faintly in the darkness. It was like no other door he'd seen before. It stood alone in the middle of the void, as if it had always been there, waiting for him. But as he stepped closer, his breath caught in his throat. The moment he touched the door, the reflection came flooding back, his grin, the thing inside him that had taken root. The letter had warned him, and he had ignored it. He was supposed to step through this door, wasn't he? But what would happen if he did? The door creaked open as though it had been waiting for him, waiting for this exact moment. A gust of cold air rushed through the opening, and Isaac felt a chill run through his entire body. The door was no longer a passage to somewhere else. It was a doorway to himself, to his own fear, to the thing that had been waiting for him. The moment he stepped through, the world changed. He wasn't in the street anymore. He wasn't in his apartment anymore. He was somewhere else. Isaac stumbled forward, the darkness swallowing him whole, and he heard something, the sound of breathing. It wasn't his. It was slow, steady, deep. His eyes snapped to the nearest reflection. There, in the mirror, was his face again, but different. It was older. His hair was graying, his eyes sunken, tired. And in the reflection, there was a smile. The grin stretched impossibly wide, and he heard the whisper again. "You come back. Now you will never leave." The cold hit him like a tidal wave, and he tried to scream. But there was no sound. The darkness had come. It was too late. Isaac's pulse raced as the darkness seemed to consume him, stretching out endlessly around him. He felt his feet dragging through an expanse of nothingness, the air growing colder with each step he took. The mirror, with his distorted reflection smiling back at him, was now gone, but the image lingered in his mind. He could still feel it, the deep, oppressive weight of his own future self, the one that had been waiting for him. He wasn't sure how long he had been walking, but it felt like hours, maybe days, since he had entered the door. The fog had followed him in here, curling around his legs, obscuring the path ahead. It was suffocating, as though it were alive, pulling at him, urging him to go deeper. With every step, the hallway seemed to stretch longer, the walls lined with doors, each more mysterious and foreboding than the last. They were solid, dark wood, old-fashioned and heavy, with brass handles that gleamed dully in the dim light. But each door was closed. No one was behind them. Not yet. Isaac's thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, trying to piece together what was happening. How had he gotten here? What did the letter mean? How had it all gone so wrong? He reached for the wall, hoping for some sense of grounding, but the moment his fingers touched the surface, the darkness shifted. It wasn't just the fog now. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in, like the very air was thickening with a presence, something ancient, something watching him. He tried to breathe deeply, to calm himself, but the more he did, the more the shadows seemed to press in on him. The quiet was deafening, but underneath it, there was a low hum, so faint it was almost imperceptible, like the sound of a heartbeat. Not his. Something else's. You can't hide from it, a voice whispered, soft and indistinct, but close enough to make Isaac flinch. He jerked around, scanning the empty hallway, but no one was there. Not a sound, not a movement. Just the thick fog swirling around his feet. And then he heard it again, clearer this time, louder. You can't escape the darkness. It already knows you. Isaac's legs wobbled beneath him, the weight of the words sinking deep into his gut. He backed away from the direction of the voice, but it followed him, pressing, crawling through the air like smoke. It was everywhere, now, and there was nowhere to hide. He broke into a run, his shoes slapping against the cold floor, the hallway stretching on forever. Each door he passed seemed to call out to him, beckoning him to open it, but he kept his head down, refusing to stop. He couldn't stop. Not yet. He wasn't ready to face whatever was waiting for him. He didn't know how far he ran before he saw the end. The last door. The door was different. The moment he saw it, his heart sank. The wood was darker, smoother, with intricate carvings that seemed to shift as he moved closer. A golden handle glinted in the dim light, almost as though it were beckoning him. It wasn't like the other doors. This one felt important, like it had been waiting for him. He approached it cautiously, as though expecting it to open on its own, but it remained still. The soft, almost musical hum in the background grew louder, reverberating through his chest, like a drumbeat calling him closer. The door was locked. He reached for the handle, but as his hand touched it, a jolt of electricity ran through his fingers, making him pull away sharply. He looked at his hand. No burns. No scars. But the feeling of something foreign had seeped into him. The sensation was still there, crawling beneath his skin. He turned, looking over his shoulder, half expecting the hallway to swallow him whole. But it didn't. Instead, it was as if the darkness receded, pulling back just enough for him to make sense of what was before him. In the soft glow of the flickering light, he could see a name carved into the wood of the door. Isaac Thompson. The name was his. And yet, it felt alien. As though it didn't belong to him at all. As if it had been written for someone else. For someone in the future. The realization hit him like a slap to the face. This is me. This is my door, Isaac whispered to himself, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. He didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. He had finally reached the end. But what did it mean? The hum in the air grew louder still, and the floor beneath him seemed to vibrate with an unsettling force. Something was coming. Something was drawing near. The fear that had been simmering inside him finally broke through. His own reflection was out there, somewhere, watching him. But now, it wasn't just a reflection that terrified him, it was what it represented. The choices he hadn't made, the decisions he had been too afraid to face. All of it was waiting beyond this door. With a shaking hand, Isaac placed his palm against the door. The smooth surface felt warm to the touch, as though the wood itself was alive. A sense of dread washed over him. But as he stood there, a memory flooded into his mind. The letter. The words. You will not remember receiving this. But when the time comes, you will know exactly what to do. And now, in front of this door, he did know. The question wasn't whether he should open it. The question was whether he could survive what waited on the other side. Without another word, Isaac turned the handle, and the door swung open with a creak that echoed through the empty hallway. Beyond the door was a room, a familiar room. His apartment. The place he had called home for the past several years. But it was wrong. The furniture was all in disarray, the walls cracked and peeling, the window wide open with the fog rolling in. As he stepped inside, a sense of suffocating familiarity took over. This place, this room, it was where everything had started. It was where he had made his first choices, the ones that had led him here. He had thought this was his sanctuary. But now, it felt like a prison. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, and Isaac spun toward it. The reflection. It was standing in the doorway, grinning at him, its eyes dark and hollow. Its mouth stretched wider than any human mouth could, until it looked as if it could swallow him whole. And then, it spoke, its voice chillingly familiar. You opened the door. And now, you've seen. Isaac tried to move, to run, but his body wouldn't respond. He was frozen in place, paralyzed by the horror of what he had uncovered. You're me, Isaac gasped, the words barely escaping his lips. The reflection stepped forward, its grin widening even further, the darkness around it seeping into the room like ink spreading across water. No, Isaac, it whispered. I am what you become. What you always were. Isaac's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His knees buckled beneath him as he collapsed onto the floor. He had opened the door, and in doing so, he had unleashed something that had always been there, something that had been waiting for him. And now, it was too late to close it. The reflection stepped forward, its eyes locking with Isaac's. There is no going back, Isaac. You've seen what you were never meant to see. Isaac felt the weight of its presence closing in on him, pressing down on him, suffocating him. But in that moment, in the overwhelming terror, something inside him broke free. A last, desperate thought, a flicker of defiance. He stood up. Slowly, but surely, he stood. And with all the strength he could muster, Isaac reached for the door once more. The future had already arrived. But it was not going to claim him without a fight. Isaac's heart raced as the shadow of his reflection loomed ever closer, the dark figure grinning wider with each step it took. It was his face, his voice, but not him. It was something far worse, a twisted version of everything he feared he might become. The weight of its presence was unbearable. Isaac's legs shook beneath him, but he stood his ground, clenching his fists. The reflection didn't advance, but it didn't need to. It was already all around him, an invisible force pressing against his chest, suffocating him with the knowledge of what it meant to confront his own darkest self. "You don't belong here," Isaac said, his voice shaking, but with a thread of conviction. "You're not me." The reflection tilted its head, that sickening grin never fading. "Oh, Isaac," it crooned, "you don't understand. I've always been here, hiding inside you. You opened the door. You called me out. And now, there's no way back." The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Isaac's breath came in ragged gasps. The oppressive weight of the shadows seemed to grow heavier, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he was still standing in the room or if he had been pulled into the abyss, swallowed whole by the thing that had come to claim him. His mind screamed for escape, for some way out. But the letter was right. It had warned him, and yet he still hadn't been able to grasp the depth of what was happening until now. "You can't fight me," the reflection whispered. "You've already become me." Isaac staggered back, his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't run. He couldn't hide. There was nowhere to go. And yet, in the deepest pit of his soul, he felt a surge of resistance. The urge to survive. To break free from this horrible mirror image that had always lingered in the darkness, waiting. No. Not this. Not like this. Isaac took a deep breath and, with trembling hands, reached into his jacket pocket, feeling for the letter. The letter from the future, the one that had warned him of this moment, the one that had set everything in motion. He had thought it was just some strange, surreal message. But now, it was clear. The letter had been the key, the one link between the world he had known and the world of fear, regret, and choices that had been left unmade. He pulled it out, his fingers trembling as he unfolded it, the words glowing faintly in the dim light. "You will not remember receiving this. But when the time comes, you will know exactly what to do." The words seemed to pulse with a rhythm of their own, a pulse that synchronized with his heartbeat. He read the words again and again, the weight of them settling deeper into his bones. And then, it clicked. He didn't know what to do. Isaac turned toward the figure in the mirror. His reflection, his future self, stood there, grinning, but now something shifted in Isaac's mind. He had been chasing the wrong thing all along. It wasn't just about survival. It wasn't about escaping the reflection. It was about accepting it. The reflection wasn't some outside force. It was him, a version of him, twisted by fear, regret, and the consequences of every decision he had ever made. It was the part of him he had ignored, the part of him he feared would one day swallow him whole. "You are me," Isaac whispered, his voice barely audible, but steady. "You're not separate. You're what I've been running from. But I can't run anymore." The reflection paused. The grin faltered just slightly, as if it hadn't expected Isaac to speak those words. For the first time since this nightmare had started, Isaac felt a flicker of control. "I'm done running from you," Isaac said, his voice growing stronger. "I can face you now. I know what I have to do." The reflection's smile twisted, its eyes darkening. "You think you can beat me? You think you can change what's already been decided?" Isaac stepped forward, his heart pounding, his breathing shallow but steady. "I don't need to be you." The figure's eyes widened as it stepped back. Isaac had never felt so certain of anything before. He wasn't fighting against the reflection. He was accepting it. He was becoming it. With a final step forward, Isaac placed his hand against the mirror. The surface felt cold, but solid. The figure mirrored his movements, placing its hand on the glass as well. It was like two pieces of the same puzzle, locked in place. And in that moment, the glass cracked. 4.3 The shattering. The crack spread quickly across the mirror, splintering in a jagged pattern that seemed to reverberate through the room. Isaac flinched, but he didn't pull away. He couldn't. The sound of the glass breaking was deafening, but it was also strangely soothing, as though the very fabric of his reality was being torn apart, remade. The figure in the mirror screamed, but the sound was distorted, not quite human. It reached out with a clawed hand, and Isaac felt a sudden, searing pain rip through his chest. The mirror's surface warped around his hand, the dark void on the other side stretching impossibly wide. Isaac gasped, feeling his body being pulled toward the mirror. But he wasn't afraid anymore. The terror had melted away, replaced by something else, a deep, steady acceptance. With one final push, Isaac yanked his hand free from the glass. And the mirror shattered completely. The room fell silent. The darkness that had consumed everything, that had stretched through the cracks and into his mind, was gone. Isaac stood alone in the center of the room, the remnants of the shattered mirror scattered around him. He was breathing hard, his heart pounding in his chest, but the fear was gone. The weight of the reflection, the fear of himself, was finally lifted. Isaac collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his face, not from fear, but from the relief of finally understanding. The letter had been right. He had been running from his own reflection, from the very things inside him that had terrified him. But now he had faced them, and he had survived. The room around him began to shift. The darkness lifted, and the fog that had once surrounded him cleared. He was no longer trapped in that space between realities. He was back in his apartment. The walls, the furniture, the comfort of his own space, all was as it should be. The letter lay in his hand once more, as though it had never left. Isaac unfolded it again, his breath catching as he read the familiar words. "You will not remember receiving this. But when the time comes, you will know exactly what to do." He smiled softly to himself. The time had come. And now he understood. The letter from the future had been a warning. But more than that, it had been a guide. A reminder that the darkness didn't just live in the world around him, it lived inside him. It was a part of him. And until he accepted that, he could never truly escape. As he looked at the letter for the last time, Isaac felt a strange peace settle over him. The future had arrived, and with it, the knowledge he needed to move forward. And as the clock on the wall ticked, he knew that the future wasn't something to fear anymore. It was his to shape. Story 3. The first time it happened, Emma didn't think much of it. It was late, the moonlight was creeping through her bedroom window, and the world outside was as quiet as the grave. She was tired, her eyelids heavy, sinking into the comfortable embrace of sleep. She had been drifting in and out of a half-conscious state when the whisper came. Soft, like a breath against her ear. I was, but I didn't. I can't. Emma's body froze. She heard it clearly, a voice so close to her it seemed like someone was standing right beside her. But there was no one in her room. The whisper was so faint, so fragile, like it was struggling to make itself known, but it still had power over her, rooting her in place, her heartbeat louder in her ears than the whisper itself. It was a sentence, half-spoken, unfinished, and it left her feeling unsettled. Her eyes snapped open, and she lay there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, trying to catch her breath. It wasn't a nightmare, not exactly. It felt more like a memory, something familiar but buried deep within her mind. She could remember hearing it in other dreams, too, but never so clearly. She turned her head to check the time on the bedside clock. 3:17 a.m. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The air in her room felt still, the same as it always did when she woke up in the middle of the night. She dismissed it as a strange half-dream, nothing more. But the whisper still lingered in her mind, like the echo of a song you couldn't quite remember the words to. It gnawed at her, an unanswered question, a fragment of something just beyond her reach. As she drifted back to sleep, the sound of the whisper seemed to linger in her mind, like a shadow cast by the moon. A whisper that would not be silenced. The next few nights passed in a haze of exhaustion. Emma tried to shrug off the lingering feeling, the odd sensation that something was slipping just beneath the surface of her thoughts. But when she woke the next night, it happened again. The same voice, the same unfinished sentence. I was, but I didn't. I can't. This time, the whisper wasn't faint. It was clearer, louder. Her eyes snapped open in a panic, the darkness of the room enveloping her. She was frozen in place, the voice still hanging in the air, filling the silence like an unanswered question. She sat up in bed, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Her eyes darted around the room, half expecting someone to be standing at the foot of her bed, staring at her, waiting. But there was no one there. Of course not. Emma gripped the edge of the bed, trying to steady herself, but the feeling of unease was creeping up her spine, prickling against the back of her neck. The voice felt too real, too close. It wasn't just a dream anymore. It was like the whisper had followed her into the waking world. I was, but I didn't. I can't, the words echoed in her mind. Was this something more? A warning? A message? She couldn't explain it, but deep down, she knew it wasn't just a random dream. There was something hidden in those words. Something waiting to be revealed. She shook her head, trying to dispel the thoughts. It's just a dream, she told herself aloud. It's just a dream. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Something important. Something that would come for her, sooner or later. The days passed, and the whispers continued. Every night. Every time she closed her eyes, that same voice, the same unfinished sentence. Emma had tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself it was just the residue of a restless mind. But each time the voice came, it felt more insistent, more real. She had started to notice things, the way the room felt colder when the whisper came, the way the shadows in the corners seemed to grow darker. She could no longer tell if the whisper was in her dreams or if it was in the real world. Her nights blurred together, and she began to dread the thought of sleep. The exhaustion was wearing her down, making her more irritable, more fragile. Her once quiet, peaceful life now felt like a maze, with the whispers as her only guide, and every turn led her deeper into confusion. Then, one night, as the whisper began again, I was, but I didn't. I can't, something changed. The voice paused, just for a moment, and then continued, clearer than before. I was, but I didn't. I can't, because of you. The words hit her like a punch to the chest. Because of you. The whisper wasn't just speaking to her, it was speaking about her. The sentence wasn't just unfinished anymore. It was a message. A warning. And it was directly tied to her. Her heart began to race, her skin prickling with cold sweat. She sat up in bed, her eyes darting around the room. This wasn't a dream anymore. This wasn't just a figment of her imagination. There was something more to it. Something real. For the first time in a long time, Emma felt the raw weight of fear grip her. She didn't know what was happening. She didn't know why it was happening. But she knew she had to figure it out. She had to uncover the meaning behind the whisper, behind the unfinished sentence that was growing more insistent with each passing night. And somewhere deep inside, she had the feeling that whatever it wasn't going to let her go until she did. Emma had become a shadow of her former self. The whisper, that half-spoken phrase, gnawed at her every waking moment, its words echoing in the corners of her mind. Her nights were filled with fear, each one an endless loop of dark whispers, a promise of something she couldn't escape. The voice had shifted, becoming more insistent, more pointed. It wasn't just a haunting dream, it was happening. By day, she fought to maintain some semblance of normalcy. She went to work, interacted with her coworkers, ate her meals, each action mechanical, devoid of life. But the exhaustion had settled in like an anchor, sinking her deeper into a state of paralysis. She couldn't stop the whisper from following her. No matter where she went, it would find her, waiting, watching. The voice was getting louder, clearer, almost as if it was trying to warn her of something. But what? Emma could feel the weight of her own frustration building up with each passing hour. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't asked for any of it. She just wanted peace, a break from the creeping unease that had stolen her sanity. And yet, peace seemed farther out of reach than ever. She sat in the living room that evening, staring at the empty glass of water on the coffee table. The silence stretched, long and suffocating, a tangible thing that pressed against her chest. The room felt wrong. Too still. Too quiet. She glanced over at the clock on the wall. 10:46 p.m. Her eyes darted to the corner of the room where the shadows had taken on an unnatural form. They seemed deeper, more opaque, as if they were alive, aware of her every movement. Her breath caught in her throat as the whisper came again. I was, but I didn't. I can't, because of you. It came in the same chilling cadence as before, but this time the words were different. Because of you. The phrase echoed through her like a scream. It was more than a phrase, it was an accusation. Someone, was blaming her. Emma's pulse quickened, her body trembling as she stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her. She turned her head sharply, looking around the room as if expecting someone to be standing behind her, whispering the words into her ear. But there was nothing. No one. just the oppressive weight of silence. She rubbed her temples, trying to calm her racing thoughts. What was happening? What was it trying to tell her? She couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers. The next day, Emma went to work, but her mind was elsewhere. The whispers had infiltrated her every thought. She couldn't focus. She couldn't think straight. Every noise, every person, felt like an intrusion on the truth she was trying to uncover. What was the meaning behind the phrase? Because of you. Was it connected to something from her past? Had she done something she couldn't remember, something that had set this entire chain of events into motion? She walked into the coffee room at work, her coworker, Janet, busy pouring herself a cup. Janet looked up and smiled, but Emma could barely register it. She was distracted, her mind clouded by the whispers. The words circled in her head, relentless. Emma? Janet's voice broke through her thoughts. Are you all right? You look tired. Emma blinked and forced a smile. Yeah, just a little tired. Not sleeping well. Janet nodded sympathetically. I get it. That full moon last week really messed with my sleep cycle. But hey, it'll pass. Right, Emma replied, but her mind was far away. A full moon. The timing was strange. The whispers had started around the same time. Could it be a coincidence? She spent the rest of the day in a fog, barely able to keep up with her work. Every few minutes, the whispers would return. She would hear them as clearly as if someone were standing right next to her. Because of you. After work, she couldn't stand it anymore. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal. She needed to understand what was happening. When she returned home, she sat down at her kitchen table, the silence pressing on her. The letter she had received weeks ago, the one she had pushed aside in a vain attempt to keep her life together, sat on the counter, waiting for her to face it. She picked it up. You will not remember receiving this. But when the time comes, you will know exactly what to do. Her hands trembled as she reread the words over and over. The letter had been in her possession before any of this had started. But now, it felt more significant, like a clue, like a map that was leading her toward the truth. She pulled out a pen and began to write. Anything. Everything. She had to uncover the source of the whisper, the meaning behind the unfinished sentence. She had to break the cycle. The words flowed from her pen in a frenzy, sentences spilling out that didn't make sense. But the more she wrote, the clearer the path seemed to become. The phrase "because of you" kept reappearing over and over again. And with each repetition, Emma began to feel a deeper connection between herself and whatever force was behind the whispers. It wasn't just a voice anymore, it was a presence. Something that had been tied to her life, to her choices, in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. As she scribbled down the last of her thoughts, something clicked. Her mind raced, pulling at the threads of her memories, the fragments of the whispers, and the letter. And in that instant, Emma realized the horrifying truth. The unfinished sentence wasn't a warning, it was a truth. One that had been buried deep inside her all along. The whispers were not an intrusion. They were a part of her. A part she had forgotten. That night, Emma tried to sleep. But the moment she closed her eyes, the whispers came again. They had grown stronger now, more urgent. I was, but I didn't. I can't, because of you. But this time, the words didn't just fade away. They grew louder. The sentence began to fill her mind, consuming her thoughts, pushing everything else aside. And with every word, Emma saw images, flashes of memories that didn't belong to her. A door. A room. Someone she couldn't recognize, standing in the corner of the room, watching her. The smell of smoke. The cold chill in the air. The feeling of someone reaching out to her, just beyond her grasp. The sentence was hers. The memories were hers. It was all there, all tangled together. Her life, her past, her choices, it was all connected. And the realization hit her with the force of a freight train. She had done this to herself. The memories she couldn't recall were locked inside her. The unfinished sentence was not some external force. It was her own mind, fighting to break free from a truth that she had buried so deep she could no longer remember. The choices she had made, the things she had done, had led her to this moment. The whispering voice was hers. And now, the sentence wasn't unfinished anymore. The truth had been spoken. I was, but I didn't. I can't, because of you, she whispered aloud. The last part clicked into place. And just like that, Emma understood what had to happen next. Emma's mind churned as she sat in the darkened room, staring at the walls. The whispers had stopped for the moment, but the weight of the words, the full sentence now etched into her mind, remained like a brand burned into her thoughts. I was, but I didn't. I can't, because of you. She could feel the truth pulling at her, a revelation buried so deep she had kept it locked away for years. The pieces were slowly starting to fall into place, each one more disturbing than the last. She had always known there was something missing, something she couldn't quite grasp. But now, the truth was coming, and it was like a flood breaking through a dam. She closed her eyes, desperate to hold on to some shred of normalcy. No, she thought, it can't be real. This is just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, Emma knew it was no trick. The memories she had been trying to avoid for so long were beginning to surface, memories of a life she had purposefully forgotten. A life she had once lived. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her temples, trying to stop the flood of images from crashing over her. She saw the door again, an old wooden door, battered and covered with dust. It was in a place she didn't recognize, in a room that felt too familiar. The shadows in the room were too deep, the air too thick. There was someone standing there, watching her, but when she tried to focus on them, their face shifted, constantly changing, like trying to look at a reflection in broken glass. She gasped, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. This wasn't a dream. These were memories, the fragments of something she had pushed away for years. She couldn't make sense of it. The more she tried, the further they slipped from her grasp. The sentence had become more than a whisper. It was now a key, unlocking the door to something she wasn't ready to face. The truth had been waiting, but she had ignored it. Now, it was demanding to be heard. Emma walked to the kitchen, trying to shake off the overwhelming sensations that had taken hold of her. Her heart was still pounding, and every part of her felt disconnected from reality. She could still hear the whisper echoing faintly in her mind. Because of you. Her hands shook as she poured herself a glass of water. She needed clarity. She needed to breathe. But the oppressive weight of the memory of the truth she had been avoiding was too much. It pressed against her chest, pushing the air from her lungs. And then, as though answering her unspoken question, the phone rang. Emma jumped, startled by the sound that broke the heavy silence in her apartment. She picked up the receiver slowly, hesitantly, as if it would bite her. "Hello?" Her voice trembled. A soft voice, almost a whisper, answered her. "Emma, it's me." Her blood ran cold. It wasn't a name. It wasn't a familiar voice. The voice felt wrong, too familiar and yet too foreign. Her body tensed, but she didn't speak. She was afraid to. "I'm sorry," the voice continued. "I should have never left it. It's time, isn't it?" Emma's mind raced, but no words came to her. It felt like the walls were closing in again. She could barely breathe. She thought she had been ready, but now, faced with the voice from the past, the voice that was connected to all the unanswered questions, she was paralyzed. "Who is this?" Emma whispered, but the words barely escaped her throat. The voice on the other end sighed, and then spoke the words that would shatter the fragile wall between Emma's conscious self and the part of her she had buried. "You don't remember me, do you? You don't remember what you did. But you will. Soon." Before Emma could respond, the line went dead. Her hand fell limp at her side, the receiver dangling uselessly. The room seemed to close in on her. She felt dizzy, like the world around her was spinning too fast. That voice, it was connected to the unfinished sentence. Connected to the things she didn't want to remember. And she realized, with a horrible clarity, that whatever had happened in her past, she had been running from it. She had buried it so deep inside that she had almost convinced herself it was just a nightmare. But now, it was real. Her knees gave way beneath her, and she sank to the floor, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. The memories were here. They weren't going away. 3.3 The Return. Emma sat on the floor for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of the conversation, trying to process the weight of the words. The voice had said she would remember soon. The question that gnawed at her now was, what exactly would she remember? The air in the apartment felt heavy, thick with something she couldn't identify. The walls closed in around her as she stood up, her body feeling foreign, as though it wasn't entirely hers anymore. She crossed the room to the hallway mirror and stared into it, expecting to see the same face, the same reflection she'd always known. But when she looked closer, she saw something different. Her reflection was blurry, but only for a second. It quickly sharpened, and the face that stared back at her wasn't hers at all. It was someone else's face. But when she blinked, the image was gone, replaced by her own, tired eyes. She took a step back, her hand gripping the edge of the counter for support. The image had been so fleeting, so real. And the sudden surge of recognition almost choked her. Who was that? The question echoed in her mind, unanswered. But deep within her, she knew the truth. She had been here before. She had been in that moment, trapped, unable to escape. And the figure in the reflection? It was her, or at least, a version of her. It was the ghost of a woman who had lived another life, before the whispers, before the forgetting. She had done something, something she had buried, but what? What had happened? Emma didn't know the answer, but the letter from weeks ago was becoming clearer. She had opened the door to her past, and now it was closing on her. The unfinished sentence was the key to unlocking everything. It was her sentence, her past, and the time had come to face it. She had to find out what had happened. There was no running anymore. There was no escaping. The past was here, and it was waiting for her. And as she stood in front of the mirror, she knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, whatever memories came rushing back, she wouldn't be able to face it alone. The air was thick with dread, every breath Emma took feeling like an intrusion. Her thoughts were fragmented, swirling around the fragments of memories that were finally starting to surface, memories she wasn't sure she wanted to remember. The reflection, the whisper, the voice on the phone, it all pointed to something terrible, something real that had happened in her past. The room was suffocating, the walls closing in, as if they were pressing against her chest, forcing her to confront the truth that she had been running from. She had opened the door to the past, but now that it was ajar, she couldn't ignore what was coming through. The sentence, the one that had been echoing in her mind, I was, but I didn't. I can't, because of you. It wasn't just a random series of words. It was a message, a revelation of everything she had done. She stood in front of the mirror once again, staring at her reflection. Her hand, trembling, reached for the door handle. But there was no turning back now. The truth would come, whether she was ready or not. She knew what she had to do. It was time to face the past, to unlock the memories she had buried deep inside. The door to her memories was not locked. It had never been locked. The moment her hand touched the doorknob, a strange calm washed over her. She felt the weight of the years that had passed, all the time she had tried to bury the memories, to push them down and pretend they were nothing more than bad dreams. But now, as the door creaked open, the truth poured in like water flooding a broken dam. It was an apartment, familiar but twisted. The same place she had lived in, but older. The furniture was different, the decor faded, worn. And there, in the corner, was a figure. A woman. She was facing away from Emma, standing still as if waiting. The voice returned, softer now, but still unmistakable. I was, but I didn't. I can't, because of you. The woman turned slowly, her face partially obscured by shadows. But when Emma saw her eyes, her heart skipped a beat. The woman's face was her own. A version of her, older, with hollow eyes and a haunted expression. I remember you, the woman whispered. You don't know me, but I know you. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't speak. The words seemed to have evaporated from her mind, leaving only the cold, suffocating realization that she wasn't just remembering the past, she was reliving it. The woman took a step forward, her eyes never leaving Emma's face. You've forgotten. You erased me. But now you have to remember. Emma's knees buckled beneath her as the weight of the words crashed into her. This was her past, her lost time, the time she had tried to forget. She had been running for years, avoiding the consequences of something she had done. What happened? Emma whispered, her voice shaking. The woman, her future self, closed the distance between them. You made a choice, she said. a choice you couldn't take back. The memories flooded back in an instant, and with them came the sharp sting of guilt. Emma remembered the night, the argument, the anger, the choice she had made. She had chosen to leave, to walk away from the person she loved. She had thought it was for the best. But in doing so, she had severed a part of herself, a part of her soul. The woman standing in front of her was the ghost of that lost self, the part of her that had been buried so deep that Emma had forgotten it entirely. "I left him," Emma whispered, the words coming out in a rush. "I left him, and I thought it was the right thing to do. But I was wrong." Her reflection, her future self, nodded slowly. "You didn't just leave him. You left us." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had never realized that her actions had consequences far beyond her understanding. She had abandoned not just someone else, but herself. The guilt, the regret, had festered in the depths of her soul, and now it had come to claim her. "But I couldn't go back," Emma said, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't know how." "You never had to go back," the woman said softly. "You only had to forgive." The room felt colder now, the shadows deeper. The figure before her wasn't just a ghost, it was a part of her past, a manifestation of the parts of herself that she had rejected. The unfinished sentence that had haunted her was now complete. "I was, but I didn't. I can't, because of you." The sentence wasn't just about leaving someone behind. It was about the decision to sever a part of her soul, to deny herself the truth. The words weren't just a whisper, they were the key to understanding why the past had come crashing into her present. She had never been able to face the guilt. She had tried to move on, but every step she took, the whisper followed. She had tried to forget. She had tried to escape. But the truth was here now. You cannot outrun yourself. Emma's knees shook, her chest heaving as she faced the full weight of her choices. The guilt had always been there, buried beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And now it had. The woman, the reflection, wasn't just a figure. It was her own face, her own soul, split between what she had been and what she had become. "I never meant to hurt you," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. The woman reached out a hand, and Emma hesitated for only a moment before taking it. In that moment, the truth was revealed fully. The guilt was real, but it could be forgiven. It could be faced. As their hands touched, a strange calm washed over Emma. The air around them seemed to shift, the weight of the room lightening, and the shadows began to recede. She could breathe again. The woman, her reflection, her past, smiled softly, a sad but understanding smile. "It's time to move forward, Emma. The sentence is finished. Now you can begin to heal." And as Emma stood there, her future self fading into the shadows, she finally understood. The whispers had never been a punishment, they had been a reminder. A call to confront what she had hidden. And now, as the darkness lifted, Emma felt the weight of her past slip away. She was free. The room returned to normal. The shadows were no longer pressing on her, and the air felt lighter. She was standing alone now, the echoes of the past fading into the distance. Emma took a deep breath, a new sense of clarity flooding through her. The unfinished sentence was no longer unfinished. The truth had been spoken. And now, she could move forward. As she looked around the room, she noticed something. The mirror was gone. The reflection, the haunting face, was nowhere to be found. It had all been a manifestation of her own guilt, her own unresolved past. She didn't need the mirror anymore. The truth had been revealed. The unfinished sentence had finally been spoken. And for the first time in years, Emma felt at peace. Story 4. It started small. The first time Jacob noticed something was wrong was a Tuesday. The day was routine, mundane. He sat at his kitchen table, sipping his morning coffee, trying to shake off the grogginess of the night before. His wife, Sarah, was humming in the next room, preparing breakfast for their daughter, Lily. Everything seemed normal. But as Jacob watched Sarah move about the kitchen, something in his chest clenched. He couldn't remember the last time he had kissed her goodnight. Or had they? Had they even shared a bed last night? The thought flitted through his mind and was gone just as quickly. But the unease remained. He pushed it aside, chalking it up to stress at work or the exhaustion that had been building for weeks. But it was when Sarah asked if he had seen Lily's drawing on the fridge that he felt the true weight of the growing emptiness. "Don't you remember?" Sarah asked, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips as she handed him a cup of coffee. Lily's drawing? She spent hours on it. Jacob blinked, confused. "What drawing?" Sarah's smile faltered for a split second. "You know, the one she drew for you last week. The one with the sun and the house." He stared at her, his mind scrambling, but he couldn't recall it. He couldn't picture Lily, his little girl, holding a crayon, creating something for him. The memory didn't exist. His chest tightened. I don't remember that." Sarah looked at him, her smile now gone entirely, replaced by a concerned frown. "Jacob, are you okay?" He shook his head, trying to shake the feeling of vertigo, as if the floor beneath him was unstable. "I don't know. I think I'm just tired." But he wasn't just tired. He felt like a piece of his reality had been peeled away, like there was a hole in his memory that he couldn't fill, and that scared him more than anything. He didn't like the thought that he had forgotten something so important, something his own daughter had created for him. What else was slipping through the cracks? Later that afternoon, Jacob went to work, his mind preoccupied with the morning's incident. He pushed it to the back of his mind and threw himself into his tasks at the office. But the feeling of unease followed him, lingering like a shadow that wouldn't leave. It happened again. This time, it was a colleague. Kate. He had worked with her for years, seen her every day in meetings, had lunch with her on occasion. She was friendly, professional. But when she greeted him by name in the hallway, something about it struck him wrong. "Good afternoon, Jacob," she said with a smile, her voice light, as if they were picking up from a conversation they had just had. Jacob froze for a second. He didn't remember the conversation. The memory of Kate, of their interaction, had completely escaped him. He forced a smile, trying to play it off. Hey, Kate," he replied, his voice strained. But it wasn't just the absence of the conversation. It was her face. His eyes scanned her features, and something didn't line up. He had seen her 1,000 times, but now, something about her face looked different. More blurred. Like he was trying to remember something he couldn't quite grasp. "Jacob?" Kate's voice broke through his thoughts. Are you okay? You look a little pale. He shook his head quickly, trying to focus. Yeah, just tired. Long night. Kate nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She looked at him for a moment longer, then continued down the hall. Jacob stood frozen in place, watching her walk away. His thoughts scrambled. He couldn't understand what was happening to him. The gap in his memory wasn't just about missing moments, it was about whole people. His own colleagues, his own family. Faces that should have been familiar felt distant, as though they belonged to someone else's life. When did they become so foreign? That evening, Jacob couldn't stop thinking about the morning's incident with Sarah and the strange encounter with Kate. As he sat down to dinner with his family, everything seemed off. His daughter, Lily, smiled at him with that same innocent smile she had given him 100 times, but tonight it looked different. Almost as if he was seeing her for the first time, or worse, seeing her for the last time. He couldn't remember the last time he had held her hand. He couldn't remember the last time they'd shared a laugh. And that feeling of loss, of something slipping away, clawed at him like an invisible presence. Daddy? Lily's voice pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. Are you going to the park tomorrow? You promised. Jacob blinked, the words I promised reverberating in his mind, but there was no memory of making that promise. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. What had he forgotten? What else had vanished? He couldn't recall the last time he'd been to the park with her. How many days had passed where he hadn't spent time with his daughter? Had she grown in the past few weeks? Of course, sweetie, he finally managed to say, forcing a smile. Lily beamed, her innocent joy stark against the creeping dread that continued to coil around his mind. That night, as Jacob lay in bed, trying to escape the spiral of confusion that had overtaken him, he heard the whisper again. The same voice, the same half-spoken phrase. I was, but I didn't. I can't. This time, it wasn't in his dreams. It wasn't an illusion. The voice was clear, unmistakable, like someone standing at the foot of his bed. The words hung in the air, an unfinished sentence that refused to be ignored. Because of you. His breath caught in his throat. The words repeated over and over until they consumed him entirely. He tried to scream, to call out, but no sound left his throat. His chest tightened with fear, the whisper becoming louder, more insistent. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Jacob sat up in bed, drenched in sweat, his heart racing. The dark room felt like a cage. He had to understand. He had to fix whatever was happening to him before it was too late. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't remember. He had already forgotten so much. Jacob spent the next few days trying to ignore the growing unease that gnawed at him. The whispers, I was, but I didn't. I can't, because of you. And continued every night, clearer than before, always fading into a terrifying silence that left him grasping for meaning. Every day felt like a constant struggle to piece together the fragments of his life that were slowly slipping away, like sand through his fingers. At work, things weren't any better. He avoided Kate, the strange encounter with her still fresh in his mind. But that was only part of the problem. The people around him felt increasingly distant, and his colleagues' faces began to blur when he wasn't looking directly at them. Names and faces, once so familiar, were growing more and more alien to him, like strangers filling the empty spaces of his memory. At lunch, he bumped into Greg, a longtime coworker, who greeted him with a wide smile. "Hey, Jacob. You've been looking out of it lately. Everything good?" Jacob blinked at him, trying to remember the last conversation they'd had. Had they spoken recently? He couldn't recall. A cold shiver crawled up his spine as he forced himself to smile back. "Yeah, just tired." Greg eyed him with concern, but Jacob couldn't quite place the look. Something about it felt like pity, as if Greg knew something he didn't. "You sure? You've been acting weird for a while. Almost like you're not here, you know?" Jacob's stomach churned. Was that it? Was he becoming a ghost in his own life? Maybe it was just the stress, maybe the exhaustion of work, but something about the way Greg spoke made it feel like there was something darker underneath. "I'm fine," Jacob said, his voice sounding too hollow, even to his own ears. "Just need a good night's sleep." Greg gave him a long, studying look, and Jacob felt his insides twist. "Okay, man. But if you ever need to talk, you know where to find me." With that, Greg turned and walked away, his steps echoing in Jacob's mind long after he was out of sight. Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that his disconnection from the world had started to spread. The missing pieces of his memory were no longer limited to a few forgotten details. His whole life was becoming fractured. His relationship with Sarah, his moments with Lily, everything was dissolving, piece by piece. That evening, Jacob sat at his kitchen table, staring at the pile of bills and paperwork in front of him. He couldn't focus on any one thing for too long. His mind kept wandering, the pieces of his life slipping just out of reach, like a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces. He rubbed his temples, hoping to stave off the headache that had been throbbing at the back of his skull for days. The whisper came again, like a cold wind sweeping through the room, though the windows were shut tight. But I didn't. I can't, because of you." Jacob shuddered. The sentence seemed to be both a question and an accusation, wrapped in a veil of dread that left him paralyzed. He couldn't shake it. The weight of it, the finality in the words, pressed down on him like a physical force. Was it all his fault? Had he caused this? What was this thing, this presence, that had followed him into his waking life, out of his dreams? In a fit of frustration, he grabbed his coat and left the house, the need to escape the growing suffocation overwhelming him. He needed answers, needed to figure out what was happening, but the more he thought about it, the more elusive everything became. He went to the one place he knew would give him some semblance of peace, the local library. The smell of old books, the muffled quiet, everything about it was comforting. For the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe. Jacob wandered through the aisles, pulling books off shelves at random, searching for anything that might offer an explanation. His mind was a mess of disjointed memories, and every time he tried to focus, the missing parts of his life seemed to slip further away. After hours of searching, Jacob found himself in front of the history section, staring at a thick, dusty book. The Mind and Memory, Understanding the Fragile Connection. It seemed too clinical, too detached from the horror he was feeling, but there was something about it that called to him. He opened the book, his eyes scanning the text, until one passage caught his attention. Memory is a fragile thing. When one's mind begins to deteriorate, the very fabric of identity can tear apart. Sometimes it is not the mind that forgets, but something much darker. When certain memories are suppressed or erased, they don't simply vanish. They are consumed, fed on by an entity that thrives on the absence. This entity, known as the memory eater, feeds on what we forget. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. The words stared back at him as if they had been written just for him. He scanned the page, his breath quickening. The passage went on. The memory eater will erase not only memories, but also the people connected to them. Once the memory is consumed, those forgotten will cease to exist, vanishing from reality altogether. Jacob felt the blood drain from his face. This wasn't just a theory, it was a warning. He wasn't just forgetting things. He was forgetting people. And when they were forgotten, they vanished completely. The implications of what he was reading hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just losing fragments of his life. People were disappearing. They were being erased by the very act of forgetting. The book dropped from his hands, and Jacob staggered backward, his mind reeling. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady himself. He needed to get home, needed to fix this before it was too late. By the time Jacob arrived home, the weight of the book's revelation had settled over him like a suffocating cloud. He couldn't ignore the cold, hard truth anymore. The people he was forgetting weren't just fading away. They were vanishing, out of his life, out of existence. He needed to find a way to stop it. He rushed through the door, only to stop dead in his tracks. The house was quiet, too quiet. Lily's laughter, which usually echoed through the halls, was absent. The kitchen was empty. The house, once full of life, now felt hollow, as though it was waiting for something to happen. "Sarah?" Jacob called, his voice hoarse. No answer. His pulse quickened as he moved through the house, each room darker than the last. There was a stillness, a coldness in the air, like the life had been drained from it. Finally, he reached the living room, where Sarah's belongings were still in their places, her purse on the couch, a book left open on the coffee table. But she was gone. And that's when it hit him. Sarah had disappeared. The memory of her was slipping from his mind, like sand through his fingers. He tried to remember her face, but it was blurry, distant, as if he were trying to recall someone he had never known. She was gone. And with her, all traces of her presence were fading too. He stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. No. No, no, no. He shook his head violently, but the panic had set in. She was gone. His daughter was gone. Everyone he had ever known was slipping from him. And he couldn't stop it. He couldn't remember enough to hold on. Jacob stumbled around his empty house, his hands shaking uncontrollably as the realization of what had just happened settled into his mind. Sarah was gone. Lily was gone. He could still feel their presence, faint traces of them in the air, but the harder he tried to remember, the more elusive they became. The memories were evaporating, slipping through his fingers like smoke. He ran to the phone, dialing Sarah's number with frantic fingers, his heart racing. It rang twice before going to voicemail. "Sarah, please, pick up," he begged, his voice strained. "Where are you?" What's happening? The phone line crackled, a faint buzzing sound in the background, before the voicemail picked up. His pulse quickened. Please, Sarah, please, just answer me. But there was no answer. The silence on the other end of the line felt like a death sentence, a confirmation of what he feared most. Sarah was gone, and the memory of her was fading, like everything else. Jacob slammed the phone down, the frustration bubbling up inside of him. How could this be happening? How could he be forgetting the people he loved, and why was it happening to him? He turned his gaze to the front door, as if expecting someone to walk through it, but the house remained still and lifeless. He felt the darkness creeping in, growing thicker with every passing second. His mind was spinning in circles, trying to find an answer, but the harder he tried to grasp hold of something solid, the more it eluded him. His thoughts turned back to the book he had read earlier. The Memory Eater, the entity that fed on what was forgotten. The words in that book had been clear, and now, as Jacob stood in the middle of his empty home, he realized the full scope of the terror that was consuming him. He wasn't just forgetting memories, he was losing people. Jacob's mind raced as he paced the room. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was happening, why his memories were slipping away, why the people in his life were disappearing. You didn't just leave them. You erased them. The words from the book haunted him. He had thought it was just a metaphor, a strange theory, but now he knew it wasn't. It was real. The more he forgot, the more people vanished from his life, and soon he would be left with nothing but an empty, hollow existence. He grabbed his jacket and rushed out the door, not knowing where he was going, just driven by the desperate need to find someone, anyone who could help him. As he walked through the streets of his neighborhood, everything felt wrong. The streets were quieter than usual, the houses dim, and the trees, usually full of life, seemed to droop under the weight of the silence. He turned a corner and found himself on the outskirts of town, near the old cemetery. The place was deserted, the graves long abandoned. But something about it called to him, beckoning him toward the place where memories were buried. The cemetery gates creaked as he pushed them open, the sound like a warning in the air. He stepped inside, the damp earth beneath his feet making a sickening squelching sound. The wind whispered through the trees, sending shivers down his spine. And as he walked deeper into the cemetery, a thought began to form in his mind. What if I can't stop this? What if I forget everything? The air grew heavier with each step, and the weight of his own thoughts began to feel unbearable. The faces of his family, his wife, his daughter, were fading from his memory, and he couldn't hold on to them no matter how hard he tried. The graveyard seemed endless. The tombstones, withered and worn, stood like silent sentinels, watching him with vacant eyes. There was something about the place, something oppressive, as though it too had been forgotten. As if time had stopped there, and now it was waiting for him to join it. A flash of movement caught his eye. A figure stood near one of the gravestones, its features obscured by shadow. His heart skipped a beat as he approached, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but instead, it stepped toward him, its footsteps slow and deliberate. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The closer the figure came, the more familiar it seemed, yet it was a face he couldn't place. It was like seeing a ghost, someone from his past, someone he should know, but couldn't remember. The figure stopped in front of him, its face now visible in the dim light. Jacob's heart raced as he stared at the person standing before him. It was Sarah. But it wasn't Sarah. Her eyes were vacant, her face pale and drawn, as if she had been lost for years. She stared at him with an expression of hollow emptiness. "Sarah?" Jacob whispered, his voice breaking. She said nothing, just stared. The more Jacob looked, the more he realized something was terribly wrong. Her features began to distort, shifting in unnatural ways. Her eyes seemed to shift from one shade to another, flickering like the pages of a book flipping too quickly to be read. The mouth, the words, twisted, but no sound came from her lips. He took a step back, his chest tightening with fear. He reached out toward her, but before he could touch her, she faded into the mist, disappearing into the cemetery's shadows. Jacob was left standing there, breathless, his body frozen in place. His pulse hammered in his ears. The truth settled on him like a weight he couldn't lift. Sarah, his family, everyone he had known, was being erased. And as he stood there, alone in the cemetery, he realized there was nothing he could do to stop it. The memory eater had come for them. Jacob returned home, his mind reeling. The cemetery, the figure, Sarah, everything had been real, and yet it felt like he was losing his grip on reality. His world was slipping further and further away, and no matter how hard he tried to hold on, the people he loved were fading into the abyss of his forgotten memories. That night, the whispers came again, but this time, they weren't just in his mind. They filled the room, the air thick with the weight of the unfinished sentence. "I was, but I didn't. I can't, because of you." Jacob woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. He sat up, his hands gripping the sheets as the words echoed in his mind. The sentence, his life, was slipping away, one piece at a time. The people who had once mattered to him were vanishing, and he was powerless to stop it. As he stared into the darkness of his room, he realized that he had already lost so much. But there was one thing he still had left. His memory. He had to hold on to it, to fight against the darkness that was consuming him. But deep down, Jacob knew that the more he fought, the more he risked forgetting everything that had ever mattered. And soon, it would be his turn. Jacob woke up the next morning to the sound of silence, a thick, oppressive quiet that wrapped itself around him like a suffocating blanket. The whispers were gone, replaced by an unsettling emptiness that stretched across his mind. He had woken up in his own bed, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Nothing did. It was like the world had been stripped of its color, its vibrancy, leaving only shadows. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone on the nightstand. He glanced at the screen, desperate for a connection to reality, but the message waiting for him made his heart skip a beat. "Sarah is gone." The words were simple, but the meaning was clear. The fear that had been growing inside him was now a tangible presence, a living nightmare that had taken everything he loved. Sarah, Lily, his life, everything had been erased, one memory at a time. He had tried to stop it. He had tried to hold on, to fight back against the memory eater that had slowly consumed his past, his relationships, his very identity. But now, the truth was undeniable. He had forgotten them, and now they were gone forever. Just as the book had warned. Jacob staggered out of bed, his body weak, his mind spinning. He tried to focus, tried to think of something, anything, that might help him remember. But the harder he grasped at the fading threads of his past, the more elusive they became. His memories were like fragments of a dream, slipping through his fingers no matter how tightly he tried to hold them. The house felt empty, cold. The walls closed in on him as he wandered through the rooms, desperately searching for something that might anchor him to his life before. But every surface, every corner, was devoid of the people he once knew. It was as if they had never been there at all. His heart clenched as he entered Lily's room. The walls were still decorated with her drawings, her toys scattered across the floor as if she had just been playing here. But the absence of her laughter, her voice, was deafening. He ran his hand along the edge of her desk, where the drawing she had made for him once sat. The drawing was gone. Everything was gone. Jacob's mind spiraled. He felt like he was drowning in an ocean of confusion and guilt. He could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the only sound in the house. But then, just as quickly as it had faded, the whisper returned. But I didn't. I can't, because of you. The voice echoed in his ears, louder this time, filling the room. His breath hitched as he spun around, looking for the source. But there was nothing. No one. Because of you, it repeated, each word more insistent than the last. He clenched his fists, tears springing to his eyes. I didn't mean to forget. I didn't know. Please, his voice cracked, unable to form the words. The guilt was unbearable, pressing in on him from all sides. He collapsed to his knees in the middle of the room, his mind unraveling as the voice continued to whisper, the sentence now complete and yet still unfinished. Every word sent a shiver down his spine, a feeling of dread settling over him like a thick fog. He had caused this. He had been the one to let the memory eater in, to allow the whispers to consume him. And now, there was no escape. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, and for a moment, Jacob could have sworn he saw a figure standing just beyond the door. The figure was blurry, its features shifting, but it was unmistakable. It was Sarah. Her face was hollow, her eyes empty. Her lips moved, but no sound came. It was as if she were trying to speak, but her voice was trapped, unable to reach him. I'm sorry, Jacob whispered, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry. He reached out toward her, but as his fingers brushed the air, she disappeared, fading into the shadows like a dream that couldn't be held onto. And then the truth hit him. The memory eater was not just an entity. It was him. He had become the eater, the one who had consumed his own memories, his own life. He had forgotten them, and now they were gone forever. Jacob stumbled to his feet, the weight of the truth crashing down on him. He was losing himself. Losing everything. But there was one thing left. One last chance to stop the cycle, to break free from the grip of the memory eater. The letter, the one he had found weeks ago, the one that had seemed so insignificant at the time, was still in his pocket. It was time to open it. Time to understand what it had meant, what it had been trying to tell him. With trembling hands, he pulled the letter from his jacket pocket. His eyes scanned the words, the same ones he had read before, but this time they held a different meaning. You will not remember receiving this. But when the time comes, you will know exactly what to do. Jacob's heart raced. He had read the letter before, but now it felt like it was meant for this moment. The time had come. He knew what he had to do. The words on the page were fading, just like everything else in his life, but this time they didn't vanish completely. They stayed, lingering in his mind, as if they had been waiting for him to remember. Because of you. The sentence came back to him in full. The truth he had been running from was now inescapable. He was the one who had caused the disappearances. He had chosen to forget, and now the people he loved were gone. But there was one final choice left to make. Jacob's hand shook as he tore the letter into pieces, letting the scraps fall to the floor. The words, "because of you," no longer held the power over him. He had remembered, and in remembering, he had broken the cycle. The memory eater no longer had control over him. As the pieces of the letter scattered around him, Jacob's breath slowed, the tension lifting from his chest. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of clarity. He had faced the truth, and now he could let go of the guilt. The house around him felt lighter, as if the weight had been lifted. The air seemed fresher, the shadows less oppressive. He had made the choice, and he had freed himself from the grip of the memory eater. But as he stood there, looking around the empty house, a chilling realization settled in. Even though the cycle had been broken, even though the whispers had ceased, the people he loved were gone. And this time, they were gone forever. Story 5. The morning light was pale, filtered through the closed blinds, casting long shadows across the room. Eleanor sat up in bed, rubbing her eyes, the faint hum of the refrigerator drifting from the kitchen. She was used to the silence of her apartment complex. The building had a sort of quiet loneliness to it, a dull hum of routine life. It was an old building, worn and tired, with narrow hallways and creaking floors. Eleanor had lived in the same apartment for 5 years, but something about it felt off recently. It was the hallways. Over the past month, she had noticed something odd. They kept shifting. The hallways of her building weren't long or particularly interesting, but each time she stepped out of her apartment and walked down the corridor, it felt different. At first, it was subtle. A corner she didn't remember being there, a light that flickered in a different place. But it wasn't long before Eleanor began to notice that the hallways didn't just look different. They felt different, too. Like they were alive. It had started with small things. The layout of the floor plan seemed to change overnight. One day, she would step out and head to the elevator, only to find a door that had never been there before. The next morning, it would be gone. A closet that didn't exist. A window that wasn't there. The hallway that had once been a familiar, unchanged space now seemed like a labyrinth. The unsettling part wasn't that the hallways seemed different, it was that no one else seemed to notice. Eleanor had tried to ask the neighbors, but they all shrugged it off, brushing it off as her imagination. But she knew what she was seeing, feeling. She wasn't imagining it. She could never quite pinpoint when the changes occurred. She would come home from work, tired, with the mundane weight of the day pressing on her, only to find the hallways different, slightly off. The elevator would take longer than usual, the floor would creak differently under her feet. The shadows in the hallways stretched a little too long, the air just a little too heavy. Last night, she had come home after another long shift at the bookstore. As she stepped off the elevator, she felt the unmistakable chill of the hallway pressing on her, the weight of something shifting just behind her, watching. The walls seemed to close in. The air felt thicker, like it was closing in on her. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the dark, empty hallway stretching out before her. But as she walked toward her apartment, something caught her eye. There, down the hallway, was a door she could swear hadn't been there before. It was old and wooden, peeling at the edges, its brass knob dull and worn, and yet she had never seen it. The door wasn't locked, though. She tried the handle. It opened with an eerie creak. She had a sudden, strange urge to go inside. But just as quickly, she shut the door again and hurried back to her apartment. Now, it was morning again, and the door was gone. Just like before. The hallway was back to its normal state, or at least, what she had come to think of as normal. But nothing about this was normal. Eleanor tried to push it out of her mind, but as the day wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had taken root inside her. Her mind kept drifting back to the door in the hallway. She didn't know what it was or why she felt drawn to it, but something about it had felt wrong. Almost like it was waiting for her. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong with the building. With the hallways. She had heard the rumors, of course. Strange things happened in the building, whispers of missing tenants, noises at night, the feeling of being watched. Some said it was just the old building settling, the creaks and groans of age. But Eleanor knew better. She knew there was something more. That night, after a long day at work, she returned home, determined to get to the bottom of it. She tried to convince herself she was being paranoid, that it was all in her head. But the closer she got to her apartment, the heavier her feet felt, as if the building itself was pulling her toward the unknown. The hallway was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the overhead lights. Eleanor moved cautiously, her steps slow, her breath shallow. She didn't know why, but the closer she got to the spot where the door had been, the more her heart pounded. She stood still, her back against the wall, listening. The sounds in the building, creaks, groans, felt closer than they ever had before. She turned the corner, and there it was. The door. It was back. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. It had appeared again, but there was something different about it this time. It seemed more real. As if it had always been there, and now it was waiting for her to notice. She swallowed hard. Her instinct screamed at her to run. But instead, she approached the door, her hand trembling as it reached for the handle. She could feel the air shift around her, the building holding its breath, as if it were waiting for her to make her move. For a brief moment, she hesitated, but then her curiosity won out. The door opened with a soft, inviting creak, and she stepped inside. The air inside the room was cold, stagnant, as if it had been untouched for years. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, the floor covered in thick layers of dust. But it wasn't the room that caught Eleanor's attention, it was the hallway beyond it. It stretched on, longer than it should have been. The hallway was dark, the lights flickering as if they were struggling to stay on. But it was the walls that really disturbed her. They weren't the same as the ones she had seen in the building. They were newer, freshly painted, but something was wrong. The lines of the hallway didn't quite match up. The angles didn't seem to line up. She walked deeper into the hallway, her feet reluctant to move forward. The hallway seemed endless. It was as if the building had swallowed her whole, pulling her further into its dark bowels. And then, she heard it. A noise, soft, at first, barely perceptible. A low Eleanor froze, her breath caught in her throat. The sound grew louder. It wasn't a hum. It was a voice. A whisper. You shouldn't have opened it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned around, but the door was gone. The hallway stretched on, now an endless, twisting corridor with no end. She was trapped. The hum turned into a chant, a chorus of voices overlapping in a cacophony of words she couldn't quite understand. The walls around her seemed to pulse, breathing in rhythm with the sound, as if the building itself were alive. Eleanor's mind raced, panic setting in. She tried to call for help, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The hallway seemed to tighten around her, squeezing the air from her lungs. She ran, but no matter how far she went, the hallway stretched out in front of her, impossibly long, a maze with no exit. You shouldn't have opened it, the voices whispered, growing louder, more urgent. But it was too late. The hallway was alive, and it was waiting for her to become part of its endless loop. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat in the silence of the hallway. She felt the walls pressing on her, as if the building itself was tightening its grip, coaxing her into deeper, darker corners. She had run for what felt like an eternity, but no matter how many times she turned corners, the hallway stretched endlessly before her. The flickering lights above cast twisted shadows, and the air grew thick with each breath she took. The hallway was never supposed to be this long. She stopped running, her body trembling with exhaustion. Sweat poured down her face, mixing with the cold sweat of fear. The voices had stopped, but the weight of the silence left her feeling exposed, like something was waiting just out of sight. She felt like a mouse trapped in a maze, the walls closing in, the exit forever out of reach. She turned around slowly, expecting to see the door, the one she had come through, at the end of the hallway. But there was nothing there. No door. No way back. Her throat tightened as her mind scrambled to understand. How did she get here? She was sure she had walked through the door, into the hallway. But now, it felt like she had entered another world, a space that didn't follow the rules of reality. The walls were too close, the angles too sharp. The floor beneath her feet seemed to undulate, shifting with a life of its own, as though the building was breathing. She reached out, her fingers brushing the wall, her skin cold as ice. The surface felt slick, wet, like something was crawling beneath it. The sensation made her skin crawl, and she jerked her hand away. There was something wrong with this place, and she was alone in it. Eleanor took another step forward, the hum of the building faintly resonating through her bones. The hallway ahead was swallowed by darkness, the light fixtures dim and flickering as if they were dying one by one. She moved cautiously, her footsteps echoing loudly in the empty space, making her acutely aware of how utterly alone she was. Then, she saw it. At the end of the corridor, a figure appeared, emerging from the shadows like a wisp of smoke. It was a person. No, it wasn't quite a person, she corrected herself. The figure was tall, too tall, with long limbs that stretched unnaturally. Its face was obscured by a hood, the shadows hiding any recognizable features. But the thing that struck her most was how it moved. It didn't walk like a human. It slithered, gliding silently across the floor, its footsteps soundless, yet the air around it seemed to crackle with an electric tension. The figure stopped when it saw her, tilting its head as if it were studying her. Eleanor's pulse quickened, her legs frozen in place. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Something was deeply wrong with this thing, something that made her want to turn and run. But no matter how much she willed her legs to move, they didn't respond. It spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural whisper, almost imperceptible at first, but it crawled into her mind like a parasite. "You shouldn't be here," it murmured. Eleanor's mouth went dry. What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. It took another step toward her, its head cocking slightly, its presence suffocating the air. The hallway seemed to shift again, elongating, the walls bending like rubber. The doors on either side, there had been doors, hadn't there, had disappeared, leaving only the oppressive darkness and the cold, steady hum. The figure came closer, and Eleanor could feel its cold breath on her face, though it never made a sound. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying that if she just closed them, it would go away. But when she opened them again, it was still there. "You are part of it now," it hissed, its voice scraping against her skull like nails on a chalkboard. The words sent a shiver down her spine. She wanted to scream, to run, to tear herself away from the nightmare that had consumed her, but her legs felt like lead. The thing was inside her mind, burrowing deeper with every passing second. Her head spun, and the walls of the hallway seemed to close in on her. The figure stepped forward again, and Eleanor stumbled backward, her heart pounding. Suddenly, everything stopped. Eleanor blinked, disoriented, her mind struggling to piece together the disjointed reality around her. The figure had vanished, the hallway was still, and the oppressive hum had faded. It was as if the building had gone quiet, its pulse slowing. For a moment, she thought it was over. She thought she had escaped. But the feeling of being watched lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. She wasn't alone. The hallway was still alive. She walked forward cautiously, her eyes darting around as if expecting another shadowy figure to appear. Her breath was shallow, her pulse erratic. She felt like she was losing herself, losing control of everything. The world around her felt like it was unraveling, bending to forces she didn't understand. And then, she saw it. At the far end of the hallway was a door. The door. Her heart skipped a beat. This was the door, the one she had seen before, the one that had led her into this nightmare. But how had it returned? It hadn't been there before. She had searched for an exit, had turned every corner, and yet now, it was waiting for her, standing just ahead. The door beckoned her, calling her. The promise of an exit. But something about it felt wrong, like it was a trap. Eleanor hesitated, her mind racing. She couldn't stay in this twisted hallway any longer, but was the door the answer, or the final part of the trap? She had to make a choice. She took a deep breath, her hand reaching toward the handle. Her fingers grazed the cold metal, and for a moment, she thought she heard a whisper again, faint, barely audible. "You shouldn't open it." But it was too late. She turned the handle. The door opened. As the door creaked open, Eleanor was flooded with light, blinding in its intensity. She had expected to see the familiar lobby of the apartment complex, the hallway she had known before. But what lay beyond the door was not reality, it was a twisted mockery of it. The world she stepped into was wrong. The walls around her were cracked and peeling, as though the building had been abandoned for years. The floor beneath her feet was covered in dust and grime, and the air was thick with the smell of rot. She could hear the faint sound of whispers, too many voices overlapping, all saying the same thing, but she couldn't understand the words. As she stepped forward, the door slammed shut behind her, the sound like a gunshot, sending a shudder through her spine. She spun around, but the door had vanished. She was trapped. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, but there were no exits, no way out, no way back. The whispers grew louder, and Eleanor's eyes widened as the shadows in the corners of the room began to stir. Shapes, indistinct and shifting, crept forward from the edges of her vision. She wasn't alone. The hallway had consumed her, and now it was feeding. The whispering voices were no longer just in her mind. They were all around her, in the air, in the walls, in the very ground beneath her. And as she turned to run, the shadows reached out to claim her. She had opened the door, and now there was no escape. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat as the door slammed shut behind her. The hallway, no, this place, seemed to shift, its walls undulating with a grotesque life of their own. The whispers became a cacophony, swirling around her like a living thing. She stumbled back, disoriented, her eyes darting from corner to corner, looking for some way out. But there was nothing. The hallway stretched before her like an endless tunnel. The walls seemed to ripple, bending and flexing as if they were breathing, alive. Every step she took seemed to distort the space around her, as if she was being pulled deeper into the very fabric of the building itself. She could feel the temperature drop, the air growing thick with tension. Get out. Get out. The words echoed in her mind, but they came from nowhere. The voices that had whispered earlier were now an overwhelming chorus, layered on top of each other, muffled and indistinct, growing louder by the second. Eleanor clutched her head, her fingers digging into her scalp as if she could force the voices to stop. She wanted to scream, to break free from this nightmare, but it felt like the walls were pressing on her chest, trapping her in a never-ending loop. She had to move. She had to find an escape. With a shaky breath, Eleanor pushed forward, her feet moving of their own accord. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving, had to keep fighting against the growing pull of the hallway. The lights flickered above her, casting strange shadows that seemed to shift and distort with each blink. A figure loomed in the distance, its outline hazy, but its presence unmistakable. Eleanor's heart raced, and her steps faltered as she watched the figure move toward her, its long, distorted limbs bending at impossible angles. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the same figure she had seen in the shadows before. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and a face obscured by darkness. It moved toward her with an unsettling grace, its head tilted, as if studying her. The darkness around it seemed to pulse, like the walls themselves were feeding off its presence. "You shouldn't have opened the door," the figure whispered, its voice a low rasp that scraped against her sanity. "You can't leave now." Eleanor tried to scream, but no sound came. She wanted to run, but her legs were rooted to the floor. It was as if the hallway had wrapped itself around her, trapping her in its twisted grip. She watched helplessly as the figure approached, its features slowly coming into focus. There was no face. Only shadows, a shifting void where its eyes should have been. The emptiness in its face seemed to draw her in, like a black hole that swallowed everything around it. "No," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. But it didn't matter. The figure reached out with one of its long arms, and before she could react, it was upon her, its cold fingers gripping her wrist with inhuman strength. The shadows seemed to leak from its body, swirling around her, suffocating her. Eleanor fought to break free, but the darkness only tightened its hold. She gasped for air, her chest constricting, but the shadowy tendrils wrapped around her, pulling her deeper into the darkness. She could feel the weight of it, the suffocating pressure of the hallway closing in on her. And then, the figure spoke again, its voice a harsh whisper in her ear. "You will never leave. You're part of it now." Eleanor struggled to breathe, the air growing heavier with each passing second. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the sound of her heartbeat was deafening in her ears. The figure's grip tightened, its cold fingers digging into her skin, and the darkness seemed to leak from every corner of the hallway, suffocating her, stealing her breath. "You're part of it now." The words echoed in her mind, their meaning clear. She wasn't just trapped in this endless hallway, she had become part of it. She had opened the door, and now she was bound to the building, to the shifting, suffocating darkness that lived within it. There was no escape. No way out. Her mind raced, desperately trying to find some way to break free. There had to be something. There had to be a way to stop this, to make it all go away. But the hallway was alive, feeding on her fear, twisting reality until she could no longer tell what was real and what wasn't. Eleanor's eyes darted around the hallway, looking for something, anything that could help. But all she saw were the shifting walls, the flickering lights, and the shadows that crept ever closer. The hallway had no end. It was infinite, a labyrinth with no exit. As the figure pulled her deeper into the darkness, her mind began to unravel. The fear was too much, the pressure too great. She could feel herself slipping, her sense of self fading away as the building consumed her. The walls seemed to breathe, pushing and pulling her in every direction, like the hallway itself had a mind of its own. The whispers grew louder, the voices overlapping and distorted, until they were all she could hear. "You shouldn't have opened the door," they chanted, repeating over and over again. Eleanor's vision blurred, and she felt herself losing control. Her body was no longer her own. The hallway was pulling her apart, piece by piece, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She was trapped in a nightmare with no end, no escape. And as the figure's shadow consumed her completely, she realized the horrible truth. The hallway didn't just move, it fed on her fear, on her memories, on everything she had ever known. She had become a part of it, a forgotten piece in its endless, shifting nightmare. Time lost all meaning. How long had she been in this place? Minutes? Hours? Days? It no longer mattered. Eleanor's mind was fractured, her sense of reality splintered into 1,000 pieces. The hallway stretched on, its walls closing in tighter with every passing second, until there was no space left for her to breathe. The figure loomed in front of her, its face still hidden in shadows, but its presence overwhelming. The shadows that had once been its cloak now seemed to swirl around her, binding her in place, tightening like a noose. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. She was paralyzed, her body consumed by the darkness. And then, it spoke again, its voice cold and unfeeling. "You opened the door, and now you are ours. Forever." Eleanor's heart stopped in her chest as the words sank in. She had opened the door, and in doing so, she had sealed her fate. She had entered the hallway's domain, and now it was her prison. With a final, soul-crushing realization, she understood that she would never leave. She would be trapped here, in this ever-shifting nightmare, for as long as the building stood. The walls closed in, the air thick with the weight of it. And Eleanor, no longer herself, was consumed by the darkness. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the hallway was silent again. The door that had once opened her was gone. The hallway, now still and quiet, waited for the next victim. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open, her breath ragged in her chest. She was lying on the cold, unforgiving floor of the hallway, her body numb as if she had been lying there for an eternity. The smell of dust and mildew hung heavy in the air, and the familiar hum of the building, which she had once thought was comforting, now felt oppressive, a constant reminder of her imprisonment. The hallway stretched out in front of her, just as it had before, but it felt different, darker, more suffocating. She pushed herself to her hands and knees, her body aching from the unnatural position she had been in. Her head throbbed with the remnants of the overwhelming fear that had consumed her. It had all been so real, so palpable. But now, in the silence of the hallway, it felt like a distant memory. The lights overhead flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and contort in unnatural ways, like the hallway itself was alive, watching her, waiting. Eleanor stood slowly, her legs shaking beneath her. Her fingers brushed the walls, but they felt distant, unfamiliar. The hallway had changed again. It was as if the building was mocking her, shifting around her like a cruel joke. She turned in a circle, her eyes darting from one end of the hallway to the other. No doors. No exits. Just endless, shifting corridors that spiraled into nothingness. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing on her, but even more than that, she felt the pull of the hallway, of the building itself, drawing her deeper into its labyrinth. Her pulse quickened as the realization hit her. She was never meant to leave. The hallway had taken her and consumed her, and now she was nothing more than a part of its endless maze. The walls were a prison, and there was no escape. Her body trembled, the dread of her situation sinking in. She felt like she was suffocating, trapped in a place that wasn't even real. Her eyes burned with tears, but there was no one to hear her. No one to help her. The whispers began again, soft at first, like a breeze, but then growing louder and more insistent. The voices, those same voices she had heard before, came from all around her, filling the hallway, echoing off the walls. You are part of it now. You cannot leave. You opened the door. We are here. We will never leave. The words wrapped around her like a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. She couldn't escape them. She couldn't escape the hallway. The thing that lived inside the walls, in the shadows, whatever it was, had her. She was trapped in its grip. The walls began to pulse, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, Eleanor thought she saw movement. She spun around, her eyes wide, scanning the space behind her. But the hallway was empty of anything but shadows. The shadows moved in the corners of her vision, stretching, twisting, like something was crawling just out of reach, waiting for her to acknowledge it. She felt it watching her, felt it growing closer with every breath. The more she focused on it, the more it seemed to move, coming toward her like a slow tide of darkness. She backed away, her feet slipping on the floor as she stumbled backwards, her body trembling with fear. She couldn't see it, couldn't make sense of it, but she could feel it, the presence behind her, the weight of the building pressing against her. And then, a voice. A low, guttural whisper that echoed from somewhere deep within the hallway. You're part of the maze now. You can't leave, not ever. Her heart hammered in her chest as the realization sunk in like a sharp blade. She had opened the door. She had stepped into the hallway. And now the building had claimed her. The world around her seemed to warp, twisting and bending like she was trapped in a fever dream. The floor beneath her feet began to shift, the walls closing in tighter with each breath, until it felt like she was suffocating in the very air. The hallway wasn't just a corridor, it was alive. It was feeding off her fear, her desperation, her memories. She was no longer a visitor. She was part of it. The hallway had swallowed her whole. Eleanor closed her eyes, her mind racing with panic. She had read about haunted places, stories of buildings that fed off the lives of the people who entered them. But this wasn't just a haunting. This wasn't just a place with ghosts or spirits. This was something far worse. This was a living entity, feeding off its victims, trapping them in an endless loop of fear and isolation. It wasn't just the hallway that moved, it was the building itself. She wasn't just lost in the hallway. She was lost in time. Eleanor's body collapsed to the floor, exhaustion overtaking her as the weight of everything pressed down on her. Her head swam, her vision spinning, her breath shallow. She couldn't remember the last time she had slept, or eaten, or even felt anything other than the crushing grip of fear. The hallway had consumed her. It had taken her memories, her sense of self, and now it was taking everything else. The shadows, the whispers, the voices, they were all part of the same thing. The building, the hallway, they weren't just physical spaces. They were prisons. They were traps. And there was no way out. Eleanor stood up shakily, her legs unsteady beneath her as she looked around the hallway. The walls seemed to ripple, the flickering lights casting long, twisted shadows that danced like dark figures. The hallway stretched on, endless and unyielding. She could hear the whispers in the walls, the soft scraping sound of something moving just out of reach. You can't leave. You won't leave. The voices taunted her, their words becoming a constant hum in her mind, driving her to the brink of madness. She knew now that there was no escape. She had become a part of it, just like the others before her. Just like the countless souls who had wandered these hallways, never to return. She took one last, desperate step forward, her heart heavy in her chest. She didn't know where she was going anymore. There was no direction, no way out. Just an endless stretch of darkness and despair. And then, she saw it. A door. At the far end of the hallway. Her heart skipped a beat. The door had appeared again, but this time it wasn't the one she had opened before. This was a new door, one she hadn't seen before. It was old, the wood cracked and faded, the brass handle tarnished with age. But there was something about it that felt different. Something about it felt like the answer. She stepped toward it, her feet heavy with the weight of the hallway, her body numb from the terror that had consumed her for so long. But just as she reached the door, she heard it. The final whisper. You'll never leave. You're one of us now. She reached for the door handle. And then, the hallway was gone. The walls. The darkness. The whispers. Gone. And Eleanor was left alone in the emptiness, trapped in the memory of what had once been, waiting for the hallway to find her again. Story 6. Maggie sat in the dim light of her living room, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the otherwise silent apartment. Her fingers lightly drummed against the armrest of the worn-out couch, the stillness of the night pressing on her. She had always been a creature of habit, and tonight, like every other night, she had settled into her usual routine. But tonight was different. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, a shift in the air, a faint stirring that didn't belong. The silence had been so oppressive, so thick, that Maggie couldn't help but notice the small irregularities. It was a shift in the rhythm of her own thoughts. Like something was waiting, watching. And then she heard it. A breath. Not from the open window where the evening breeze stirred, but from somewhere above. The ceiling. It was a slow, steady inhale, the kind you might hear from someone trying to quiet their breathing so they don't wake a sleeping child. But the sound was coming from above her, from a space where there should have been nothing. There was no attic in her apartment, at least, that's what she had been told when she moved in. No upper floor. Just the slanted roof and the rafters that kept the structure together. No space for someone to hide. The breath came again, louder this time. Deeper. More deliberate. Maggie froze. Her heart hammered in her chest, her mind trying to make sense of the sound. Her gaze flicked upward, to the ceiling above her. The texture of the plaster was cracked and aged, but there was nothing there. No sign of a hidden space. Just the cold, unyielding surface. She waited, but the room remained still. The air seemed to grow heavier, thick with an invisible weight. Maggie's hands trembled as she placed them on her lap, trying to steady herself. Her eyes darted around the room, but everything was in its place, the same as it had been all these years. Her apartment, simple and modest, was supposed to be a haven, a safe space. So why was she so scared? The breathing continued, slow and deliberate, like someone was sitting just above her, breathing in the dark, unseen. She couldn't tell where it was coming from, couldn't explain it. The walls were solid, the ceiling intact. No leaks. No loose boards or vents. Just an airtight room, sealed off from the world outside. Yet that sound, that breath, was undeniable. She tried to brush it off. It was late, and her mind was playing tricks on her. The stress of her job, the constant pressure, maybe she was imagining it. Maybe it was the wind, the house settling. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Something was there. Something was watching. Maggie stood slowly, the sound of her own movements too loud in the oppressive silence. She moved cautiously toward the kitchen, trying to steady her breath, trying to find a logical explanation. She told herself it was nothing but the rustling of the old pipes, the creaking of the wooden beams, the natural sounds of a building settling. But the feeling in her chest, the pressure of it, refused to dissipate. She grabbed a glass of water from the counter, but her hand shook as she brought it to her lips. The breath came again, and this time, she could swear it sounded closer, louder, almost intentional. Maggie's heart skipped a beat, her thoughts spinning in panic. She set the glass down with a shaky hand, her fingers lingering on the cool surface, the tremors running through her. Was it possible that someone had somehow gotten into her apartment? A stranger? Maybe a neighbor. She didn't know most of the other tenants in the building. But why would someone be above her? And how? She turned slowly, staring at the ceiling once more, trying to gather her thoughts, trying to find an explanation. But then, she saw it. The small, almost imperceptible crack in the plaster right above her. It wasn't large, just a hairline fracture in the ceiling, but it was enough to make her stomach churn. The faintest sliver of dark shadow seemed to leak from the crack, moving with an unsettling, fluid motion. It was as if the shadow itself had substance, as if it were alive. Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't imagining this. She wasn't. The air felt colder now, as if the temperature in the room had dropped several degrees in an instant. Maggie swallowed hard, her heart hammering in her chest, and before she could stop herself, she took a step backward. And that's when it happened. A loud bang. It wasn't a thud, as if something had fallen. It wasn't a creak. It was a bang. A sharp, abrupt noise that seemed to shake the very air around her. Her body froze. The breath. The sound. It was no longer just above her. Now, it was everywhere. Maggie's pulse quickened as she stepped back toward the door, her mind racing. What was that? What was it? She needed to leave. She had to get out of there. But her legs felt heavy, and her feet wouldn't move. The overwhelming sense of dread that had settled in her chest made it impossible to breathe. She couldn't just leave. Not yet. The breathing was louder now, closer. But it wasn't coming from above her anymore. It was all around her, coming from the walls. The floors. The ceiling. The air itself seemed to be alive, suffocating her, and she couldn't escape it. She could hear it, feel it, but she couldn't see it. What was it? The apartment had always been a place of peace, a quiet sanctuary from the noise of the world. But now it felt like a prison. It felt like something was waiting, something ancient and cruel, just out of sight. She wanted to scream, to run, but the fear held her in place, clamping down on her throat, choking her. And then, the air shifted. The sound of slow, deliberate breathing became sharp, inhuman. Like the sound of someone drawing in a breath through clenched teeth, the air rasping through insane lungs. It was coming from above her again. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was louder. Closer. Growing, as if something, or someone, was descending from above, closer to her. And then, a voice. A whisper. Barely audible, but unmistakable. I see you. Maggie's mind raced, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest she could almost hear it over the dreadful silence of the room. She pressed her back against the wall, her breath shallow, her body trembling. The whisper, I see you, had come again, and this time it was impossible to ignore. The words were too clear, too real. There was no mistaking it. I see you. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands gripping the edges of the countertop as if holding onto something solid would stop the room from spinning. The ceiling above her creaked, groaned, as if something Someone was moving just above, testing the floorboards, pacing, waiting. She had never felt so small, so insignificant. The apartment had always been a refuge, a quiet space in a noisy world. But now, it felt like a trap. A place where something dark had taken root, something that had been watching her long before she ever noticed it. The air felt heavy, pressing down on her, suffocating her. She wanted to scream, to run, but fear paralyzed her. Every movement felt like it was being scrutinized, every breath too loud. She couldn't escape. Not now. Not when whatever was in the ceiling was so close. Forcing herself to calm her breathing, Maggie stood motionless for several seconds, her ears straining for any hint of movement, of sound. The apartment felt too still, too silent. And then it came again, the sound of slow, deliberate breathing. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence. A presence that seemed to fill the entire room, suffocating her, filling the air with an unbearable weight. Maggie couldn't take it any longer. She had to know what was happening. She couldn't just wait, terrified, forever. She needed to face whatever was in that ceiling, whatever was watching her. Slowly, she turned, her feet dragging across the floor as she moved toward the center of the room. She had to get a closer look. She had to see it for herself. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow longer, twisting unnaturally as she made her way toward the center of the apartment. The faint flickering of the lights overhead cast eerie shapes against the walls, distorting the familiar features of her apartment into something sinister. The walls seemed to shift, as if the very air inside the apartment had become alive, moving around her in waves. She reached the center of the room and stood still for a moment, her hand hovering just above the floorboards, sensing the vibrations that rippled beneath her fingertips. She closed her eyes, listening. The breathing. It was coming from above her again. It wasn't just a random sound. It was rhythmic, deliberate. It was like the sound of someone, or something, waiting. Breathing, heavy, strained, as though it had been waiting a long time. Maggie's eyes shot open, her chest tight with fear, her body paralyzed by the sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She couldn't tell where the sound was coming from, but it was there, surrounding her, pressing on her from all sides. Her gaze darted around the apartment, desperately searching for a clue, some sign that would explain the unexplainable. The ceiling, the walls, the air. Her fingers twitched at her sides as she glanced up at the ceiling, noticing for the first time the faint shadows that seemed to cling to the edges of the room. The cracks in the plaster that had always been there, but had never seemed this alive. She reached up to touch them, but before her fingers could graze the surface, a jarring sound rattled through the floorboards. The sound of something heavy shaking above her. Maggie stepped back, heart hammering in her chest. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The room was closing in around her. Without thinking, she sprinted for the hallway. The shadows seemed to follow her, stretching as though they had minds of their own, reaching, grasping at her. As her feet pounded across the hardwood floors, she turned the corner, heading for the staircase to the building's lobby. Her pulse raced, her mind in overdrive as she pushed through the door to the narrow stairwell. But when she reached the bottom of the stairs, she found herself back in her apartment. She stopped dead in her tracks. The door behind her had closed, the hallway dim and quiet. Her heart seemed to stutter in her chest. The same hallway she had just left now stretched before her, unchanged. It couldn't be. How had she? She looked over her shoulder, and her breath caught in her throat. The apartment door she had just closed was now standing ajar, as if waiting for her to step back inside. Maggie felt herself trembling as she stood frozen in the entryway, staring at the door. She could hear the faint sound of breathing again, faint, but unmistakable. The presence above her had not faded. She was no longer certain where she had just been or whether she was still within the same place, but it didn't matter. Everything was wrong. The darkness in the hallway thickened, stretching longer than it should. The ceiling above her groaned, the faint rustling of something moving. Maggie took a tentative step toward the door, her footfalls muffled by the carpet beneath her, the dread thickening in her chest. As she approached the door, the oppressive silence of the hallway seemed to press against her, the very air charged with an unspoken tension. She turned the knob slowly, her hand shaking as she pushed the door open. The room beyond her apartment door was not the same. It felt smaller, suffocating. The walls were darker, the air denser. There was a strange energy that vibrated through the air, making her skin crawl. And then, she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible rustling from the corner of the room, like someone shifting, moving, waiting. Maggie's gaze flicked over to the far wall, where the shadows seemed to grow longer, thicker. There, in the corner, something was watching her. A pair of eyes. Or at least, that's what it seemed like, two hollow black orbs, floating in the darkness. They glowed faintly, as if there was something alive in that corner of the room, waiting for her to notice. Maggie's breath hitched in her throat. The air around her grew heavy, the oppressive weight of it almost suffocating. The eyes, those eyes, were locked onto her, their hollow gaze boring into her soul. "I see you," the voice whispered again. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The breath came faster now, louder, as if whatever had been lurking above had descended into the room. Maggie's skin prickled with cold fear. She had nowhere to run, no place to hide. She wasn't alone. The hallway wasn't just alive, it was waiting for her. And it knew her name. The hallway, the apartment, the shadows, all of it closed in on her. Maggie could feel the walls closing tighter, the air growing colder, heavier. The eyes in the corner of the room were no longer just staring, they were pulling her in, their unblinking gaze becoming more and more intense. She could feel them, like invisible fingers tugging at her mind, draining her strength. The whisper echoed again, louder this time, as though it were inside her head. "You shouldn't have opened the door." She took one final, shaky step forward, her body moving as if under someone else's control. The door seemed like the only way out now, the only way to escape the suffocating grip of whatever was watching her. But when she reached it, she hesitated. The door wasn't just a doorway anymore, it was a trap. A gateway to something worse than the dark apartment, worse than the shadow in the corner. It was the final step. The choice she had to make, to step into the unknown or remain trapped in the endless horror of the building. And with that thought, she understood. It had all been a lie. The door had never been a way out. It was always the way in. And now, there was no escape. Maggie stood at the doorway, her body frozen in place. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. The eyes in the corner of the room were still there, watching her, pulling her in with an invisible force. The darkness had become a tangible thing, stretching across the room like a black curtain, suffocating everything in its path. She couldn't tell where the room ended and the darkness began. It was all merging, one indistinguishable mass of terror. The breath that had once come from the ceiling now seemed to be coming from everywhere, from the walls, the floor, the shadows themselves. It was slow and deliberate, each inhale and exhale dragging her deeper into the nightmare. Maggie's chest tightened, her breathing shallow, as though the air itself was being sucked from her lungs. She had to leave. She had to get out. But no matter how much she willed her legs to move, they remained heavy, rooted to the spot. The room was closing in on her, the walls pressing in, the air thickening with every passing second. The whispering voices were now a constant hum in the back of her mind, drowning out all other sounds. You shouldn't have opened the door. Her pulse raced in her ears, and she could feel a tightness in her chest, as though the very space she was standing in was squeezing the life out of her. She turned her head, looking desperately for an escape. The door, the one that had led her into this place, was still open, but it no longer felt like an escape. It felt like a trap. The whispers grew louder, and she knew then that there was no escaping it. No way out. Whatever was in this apartment, whatever had claimed her, had her now. She had opened the door, and now it had opened her up to something far worse than she could ever have imagined. Eleanor had always prided herself on being strong, resilient. But in this moment, standing frozen in that dark room, she realized that nothing could prepare her for what was happening now. The walls creaked as though something was shifting, growing. She could feel the weight of the building settling around her, as if the very structure of the place was alive, breathing with an ancient, insidious rhythm. Maggie's hands shook as they rested at her sides, her nails digging into the palms of her hands. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched farther, reaching, crawling toward her. She could see them now, thin tendrils, dark shapes, like smoke twisting into the form of people. No, not people, things, beings that weren't quite human, but had once been. She wasn't sure if they had ever truly been human, or if they had always been these things, lurking in the dark, waiting for someone like her to step into their trap. The smell of decay filled her nostrils. It wasn't just the musty scent of the old building, it was something far worse. Something foul, something ancient. The air felt thick, like it was filled with particles that made it hard to breathe. She could taste it in the back of her throat. Her eyes flicked back to the corner of the room, and she felt a chill run down her spine. The eyes were gone. Or rather, they had moved. But something else was there now. A shadow. A form. A presence looming over her, growing taller, darker, until it filled the room. She couldn't make out the details, but she could feel it. The heaviness of it pressing against her. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't even move. The breathing came again, louder now. More deliberate. Each breath seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, rattling her teeth, shaking her bones. It was inside her head now, in her thoughts, crawling through her mind like an invasive parasite. It was as though it had always been there, waiting, whispering just beneath the surface of her reality. You opened the door. The voice sounded inside her head, too close, too real. It wasn't just a whisper anymore, it was a command. A certainty. You can't leave now. The words hung in the air, thick with finality. She had been marked. She had opened the door, and now there was no going back. She was part of it now. A part of whatever lived in this apartment. A part of the building, the hallway, the thing that had been watching her all this time. Her legs finally gave way, and she collapsed to the floor, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. She could feel the pressure building in her chest, the walls closing in even tighter. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The fear had paralyzed her. She had no escape. But then, there was a sound. A knock. A light tapping at the door. A gentle, insistent knock. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. The knock came again. Slow. Measured. As though the person on the other side was in no rush. She turned, blinking rapidly as though the room had suddenly come into focus. Her mind was spinning in confusion. She had been alone. The apartment had been empty. She had heard the breath, the voice, and now there was someone at the door? She staggered to her feet, her head spinning, dizziness clouding her thoughts. She could feel the weight of the building pressing down on her, but her mind couldn't comprehend what was happening. There was no one there. She was alone. She had to be. But the knock came again, louder now. She approached the door cautiously, every step making her heart race. She was afraid to open it. But she couldn't just leave it. She had to know. She had to see. With a shaking hand, she grasped the door handle, her fingers cold against the brass, and turned. When she opened it, she found nothing. The hallway was empty, just as it had always been. Her breath caught in her throat. There was no one in the hallway. No sign of anyone, not even a shadow. But the feeling, the presence, was still there, lurking, watching. She stood in the doorway, frozen, looking out into the silent hall. Then, she noticed something. The walls. The floor. They were wrong. The hallway was different. The shadows were thicker. The angles sharper. The door she had opened earlier, it wasn't the same door anymore. This wasn't the hallway she remembered. It wasn't just the door that had changed. It was the whole apartment. Eleanor took one step forward, then another, her eyes wide, searching, scanning. She couldn't tell if she had crossed into another reality or if she had simply lost her mind. Everything was shifting, warping, twisting like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. And then, she saw it. A figure at the end of the hall. Too tall. Too thin. Its limbs stretched impossibly long, its face hidden beneath a hood. It was watching her, unmoving, just like the shadows had been watching her. "It's too late for you." The voice whispered again, but it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command, an order. "You belong here now." Maggie didn't know how long she stood there, paralyzed by the sight of the figure. The shadows had gathered at her feet, curling around her legs like hungry hands, pulling her in. The figure took a step forward, and the hallway seemed to stretch longer, the shadows growing darker, deeper. The space before her became endless, as if the hallway were expanding with each heartbeat. "Come closer," the voice coaxed. "You're one of us now." Maggie didn't know why, but she stepped forward, her feet moving without her permission, her mind too shattered to resist. She was walking toward it, toward the thing that had been waiting for her. She didn't know what it was, but it felt inevitable. She was drawn to it, as if she had always belonged to this place. As she walked into the darkness, the figure's form became clearer. It was waiting for her. Its shadow loomed over her, swallowing the light, and then everything went black. Maggie woke to complete silence. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the dim light that seeped through the cracks in the walls. Her head felt heavy, her body stiff, as if she had been asleep for days. Her limbs trembled with exhaustion, but there was something else. A deep, gnawing unease that had settled into her bones, making it hard to breathe, to move. The room around her was unfamiliar. The walls were cracked, the ceiling lower than it had been, and the air was thick with a musty, damp smell that clung to the corners of the space. It was no longer her apartment, at least, it didn't feel like it. The sense of claustrophobia, of being trapped, weighed on her. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she slowly rose to her feet, unsure of where she was. Her mind raced, but there were no answers. It was like everything was blurred, out of focus, the details of her surroundings fading in and out of her perception. Was it a dream? Had she imagined it all? The breathing from the ceiling, the whispers, the figure in the hallway, all of it felt like a fragmented memory, as if it had happened in another life. She took a step forward, her bare feet brushing against the cold floor, the sound echoing in the silence. Her body felt light, as though she were floating above the ground, unsure of whether her movements were real or just an extension of the nightmare she couldn't escape. There were no windows, no doors, only the endless, oppressive walls that seemed to close in on her from all sides. The whispering returned, faint at first, like a distant murmur in the back of her mind. She stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. The voices weren't from the walls this time, though. They were coming from her own thoughts. You've always been here. There's no way out. You belong to us. The words echoed, their weight growing heavier with each repetition. She shook her head, trying to block them out, but they clung to her like a fog, seeping into every corner of her consciousness. She couldn't escape. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the truth. The truth that had been creeping up on her, hidden in the shadows, waiting for her to finally understand. The hallway. The building. The ceiling. All of it was part of the same nightmare, the same twisted cycle. And now, she was part of it too. She had opened the door, stepped into the darkness, and allowed herself to be consumed. And the worst part was that she wasn't alone. She turned slowly, her heart racing, her breath shallow. There, in the farthest corner of the room, something shifted. It was a figure, tall, thin, like a silhouette against the dim light that barely illuminated the space. Its features were obscured, its body moving in jerky, unnatural motions. It was watching her, waiting for her to notice. Maggie's eyes widened in terror. The figure was familiar. She had seen it before, the same shape, the same twisted limbs. The same haunting presence that had filled her nightmares. The same thing that had been watching her from the shadows. It moved closer, its long fingers stretching out toward her, as though it were reaching for her soul. Maggie stepped backward, her body shaking with fear, but the figure continued to advance, its shadow growing longer, darker, as it closed in on her. The whispers grew louder, drowning out her thoughts, filling her ears with their insistent chants. You opened the door. You are ours now. Maggie's pulse quickened as she stumbled back, her feet unsteady beneath her. Her mind screamed for her to run, but there was nowhere to go. No escape. The figure was closer now, its elongated limbs stretching impossibly long, its face a shadowed blur of darkness. It moved without sound, its presence suffocating, overwhelming. She couldn't breathe. Her body felt heavy, weighed down by the sheer force of its presence. She wanted to scream, to fight, but the terror held her in place, paralyzing her. The figure reached out, its fingers brushing her skin. The touch was cold, unnatural, like the icy grip of death. It didn't hurt. It was worse than pain. It was as if something inside her was being torn away, something vital, something alive. Her vision blurred, and her knees gave way, her body collapsing onto the floor. She gasped for air, the room spinning around her as she struggled to keep her grip on reality. The whispers were now a roar in her ears, overwhelming her, drowning her in a sea of madness. "You're part of it now. You'll never leave." Maggie closed her eyes, unable to fight the pull any longer. The whispers, the figure, the darkness, it was all consuming her, merging with her very soul, pulling her deeper into the nightmare. She was no longer Maggie. She was part of the building, part of the twisted, living space that had trapped her. Maggie's mind fractured, slipping away from reality as the darkness enveloped her. She no longer knew where she ended and the building began. The walls pressed in on her, the ceiling looming above, the floor beneath her giving way to an endless, suffocating void. She was trapped in the building's grasp, a puppet on strings, pulled in every direction by forces she couldn't understand. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The darkness lifted. The room was still. The whispers faded. The figure was gone. Maggie opened her eyes, unsure of where she was, unsure of what had just happened. Her body was no longer trembling. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight that had crushed her chest was gone. But the fear still lingered, like a shadow in the corners of her mind, whispering that it was not over, that it would never be over. She stood up slowly, her body aching from the tension, but the room felt different. The walls were familiar again, the same cracked plaster, the same worn floors. She was back in her apartment. But something was wrong. Something was off. The door was closed. No, it wasn't just closed. It was locked. She moved toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. She twisted it. It didn't open. Her heart sank. The room felt colder now. The same feeling of being trapped. The same dread. The same sense of being watched. And then, a noise. A breath. A slow, deliberate intake of air. It was coming from above her. The ceiling. And that's when Maggie realized the horrible truth. It would never stop. The cycle would never end. She had opened the door. She had stepped into the nightmare, and now it would follow her forever. And as the breath grew louder, she understood. She would never be free.